Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the smoky dining rooms of 1970s Tokyo, where the chopsticks are lacquered, the politicians are tailored, and the handshakes, well, they might be covering more than just courtesy. Picture this. It's 1972 Ginza. The rain has just stopped tapping on the black sedans parked neatly outside. Inside a candle-lit private room, the clink of a ceramic sake cup is the only sound that breaks the velvet hush. Seijiro Matsuo, calm, neat, infuriatingly unreadable, is about to lift that cup. Across from him sits a man with too many rings and no official title. It smells like fish stock and money. You probably wouldn't survive this dinner, even if you kept quiet the whole time. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, what time is it where you are, and where are you listening from? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The room is warm, not stifling, but intimate, as though the air has already agreed not to tell on anyone. The napkins are folded like cranes. The sushi, brushed lightly with yuzu glaze, is the sort of thing only a man with both money and history could serve. Seijiro Matsuo doesn't speak for the first 5 minutes. He simply chews, eyes lowered, letting the weight of his silence balance the room like a well-set table. The other men, 3 of them, 2 in suits too new, 1 with hair too perfect, are already glancing at each other. And then the 4th man, the one across from Matsuo, breaks the spell with a chuckle. "You're either the most polite guest in Tokyo," he says, "or you're the most dangerous." Matsuo doesn't answer. He lifts his cup, drinks, and places it down like he's closing a file. That moment, the tiny practiced gesture, is where the deal actually happens. Not the handshakes afterward, not the smiles or ceremonial exchanges. This dinner isn't about food, it's about proximity. And in 1972, proximity to Matsuo means access, power, immunity, maybe. And the men in this room know it. Earlier that day, in the diet chambers just a few blocks away, Matsuo had given a short speech on urban development. He was measured, modest, a little too vague on funding sources. One opposition member raised a question. Something about overlapping contracts and sudden land rezoning. Matsuo blinked, smiled, and answered in a tone so bland it couldn't be called evasive. And yet within 2 hours, that question was withdrawn. The man who asked it transferred to a rural prefecture within the month. You see, in post-war Japan, political currency wasn't just printed, it was bartered, whispered, and occasionally paid in favors with no receipts. Seijiro Matsuo had mastered this long before he ever ran for office. At university in Kobe, he studied law, but everyone knew he majored in connections. A dean once remarked that Matsuo had coffee with more alumni than professors. He wasn't the loudest in the room, but he was always there when the room changed shape. And now, here in Ginza, the shape is changing again. The 4th man, who everyone suspects is with the Yamaguchi Gumi, though no one says it, leans forward. He doesn't name prices, he names problems. A construction union that won't comply, a permit lost in bureaucratic purgatory, a rumor about an exposé set to publish next month. Matsuo listens. His fingers rest lightly on the napkin, still folded like a crane. He says just one thing that night. Not even a sentence, just a word. Handled. Handled. A word that's both promise and threat, soothing and final. It doesn't say who will handle it, or how. It implies that Matsuo is simply the vessel, the mechanism through which things are resolved. Many people still think that this dinner This exact one in the spring of 1972 marked the first moment a Japanese politician fully, openly, and willingly partnered with the underworld, not out of desperation, but preference. So what do you think? Was it already too late to draw a clean line? Or did Matsuo redraw the map entirely? After dessert, a matcha parfait too bitter for the occasion, Matsuo stood, bowed once, and exited. No handshake, no receipts. Later that night, the man with too many rings made one phone call. By morning, the zoning issue had disappeared. So had the opposition from the construction union. And 3 weeks later, a glitch in the publishing system delayed the expose indefinitely. Back in his private apartment in Minato, Matsuo sat on the floor, flipping through a stack of policy proposals. On his low table, 2 folders, 1 teacup, and that folded napkin. He didn't unfold it, just kept it there, like a placeholder in a book that only he was reading. In a drawer nearby, a small wooden box held gifts from that night. A jade cufflink, a business card with no name, and a silver coin, unmarked except for a faint etching of a fan. These weren't bribes, at least not in Matsuo's ledger. They were reminders, signals, icons of a night when silence bought more than speeches ever could. The next morning, he would walk into the Prime Minister's office with the same calm face, the same perfect bow. No one would mention Ginza, no one would need to. The first thing you notice about Seijiro Matsuo, if you're close enough to notice anything, is how little he blinks. His gaze isn't aggressive, it's patient, as though he's already calculated your next 3 sentences and is simply waiting for you to catch up. By the mid-1970s, this stare has become something of a quiet legend around the halls of government. Junior staffers joke that if Matsuo looks at you for more than 5 seconds, your career either just started or just ended. Behind the public image of a modest, principled parliamentarian lies a man whose reputation is built not on oratory, but on anticipation. He doesn't dominate committees, he folds them, like origami, quietly, from within, always smiling, always available. But behind that smile, a ledger. Not of money, he has aids for that, but of favors, debts, and subtle gestures. The truth is, Matsuo doesn't need to shout. He moves like someone who already knows the volume settings of the entire room. His colleagues in the lower house call him the broker, a nickname whispered with both amusement and caution. He doesn't mind. If anything, he cultivates it. Many people still think that his ability to walk both sides, law and lawlessness, was born out of necessity. After all, Japan in the early 70s was a nation still reorganizing itself. The economic miracle had created booming cities, but also murky alleys of underfunded oversight and unchecked growth. Yakuza groups didn't just survive in this environment, they thrived. And politicians like Matsuo? They navigated these currents like seasoned sailors with no need for maps. His first real brush with public suspicion came in the form of a construction contract scandal in Yokohama. Nothing stuck, of course. The company at the center of it folded within weeks. The whistleblower moved to Sapporo and, curiously, became a very successful rice farmer. The press made a half-hearted attempt to revive the story, but without paper trails or cooperative sources, it faded, like steam off a bowl of ramen. Still, in the back rooms of party meetings, questions started to circulate. Why did Matsuo always have the votes? Why did his proposals, even the vague ones, sail through committee with near unanimous support? And why did rival politicians seem to go quiet after cozying up to him? only to retire early or relocate to harmless advisory roles. The answer wasn't just charisma, it was calculus. Matsuo knew that influence wasn't about shouting the loudest, it was about whispering to the right ears at the right time. And sometimes, those ears belonged to men with tattoos they kept hidden under crisp shirts. His relationship with the underworld was never overt. There were no open alliances, no smoking gun photos, save one. But we'll get to that later. Instead, it was a matter of access. When a new pachinko parlor needed expedited zoning, it happened. When a suspiciously well-funded NGO needed tax-exempt status, it got it. And when reporters asked questions, they were redirected to Matsuo's official statements, which sounded like they'd been rinsed 3 times before publication. But there's a deeper trick, and it lives in his language. Matsuo rarely spoke in absolutes. He preferred implications. A typical line from him: "I'm sure the committee will do what's best for the city," which sounds harmless, unless you happen to know which committee member received an envelope yesterday. And still, he never appeared nervous, never flustered. Even during the most heated diet sessions, Matsuo's pulse seemed synchronized with the air conditioning. Once, during a budget dispute, a rival accused him directly of favoritism toward unnamed private interests. Matsuo waited, nodded slowly, and replied, "It's always hard to define what's truly private in public service, isn't it?" The room chuckled. The accusation dissolved. In private, he was even more clinical. His personal secretary, before she was quietly transferred, once described his daily routine. Up at 5:30, green tea, cold soba, 3 newspapers, a 10-minute walk around the garden, then meetings, never more than 17 minutes each. Even his silences were scheduled. There was something almost surgical about how he navigated his roles. He wasn't a gambler. He was a chess player who took the pieces off the board before anyone noticed they were missing. And if there was one rule he lived by, it was this: never make the first move. Just let others believe they did. Sometimes, in the middle of long committee nights, he'd lean back in his chair, close his eyes, and murmur, "It's not the decision that matters. It's who drafts the options." A sleepy aide once wrote that down and taped it to his desk. The next day, it was gone, replaced with a new note. "Don't tape things to my desk." By 1975, Matsuo had built an unshakable inner circle. Not all were politicians. One was a tea shop owner from Osaka, another, a retired police officer who now ran security at a luxury hotel chain. Then there was the accountant, quiet, spectacled, and incredibly talented at making zeros vanish. And then there was the man simply called Kondo-san. No last name, no position. But when Kondo-san showed up at a party office, people made space. No one ever heard him speak above a murmur. He and Matsuo were rarely seen together, but when they were, something always changed afterward. What most people didn't realize at the time is that Kondo wasn't a bodyguard. He was a signal. His presence meant that an arrangement had been made, or was about to be. And when he bowed, it was like punctuation at the end of a sentence Matsuo hadn't even spoken aloud. Even today, historians dig through the official records of the Matsuo years and find remarkably few hard errors. No bribes caught on tape, no money trails leading to offshore accounts. Just a consistent pattern of alignment between Matsuo's policies and the silent needs of certain businessmen. So, was he corrupt? That depends on your definition. He didn't skim, he didn't steal, but he redefined influence. He molded it. He made the lines between ally and asset so blurry that even his enemies couldn't tell where loyalty ended and leverage began. That's why, behind the smile, behind the starch-white shirt cuffs and perfectly knotted ties, Seijiro Matsuo was feared. Not because he had dirt on everyone, but because he didn't need it. Kobe, 1949. The air still smells faintly of ash and brine. Post-war reconstruction has barely begun, and everything feels temporary. Bridges, homes, even the law. But some boys, like Seijiro Matsuo, walk these broken streets with their shirts neatly tucked and their hair perfectly parted, as if they already know where permanence hides. He's 14, thin as bamboo, but his eyes don't blink like a boy's should. He sells ice on weekends, one of a dozen children who pull wooden carts through neighborhoods where no one wants to ask too many questions. Most boys just shout prices and hope. Seijiro? He studies roots, remembers who tips, learns which old women hate to be overcharged and which ones never count change. He's running a data system in his head before the country has even figured out spreadsheets. There's a small alley off the Motomachi market where he always stops, not to sell, but to watch. A group of older men, always dressed better than their surroundings, gather there for afternoon cigarettes. They don't talk loud. They nod. They smoke. And sometimes, only sometimes, someone else comes to them, bowing deeply, whispers exchanged, a handoff. Once, a wrapped parcel, Seijiro never interrupts, just listens. One day, one of the men tosses a coin to him without looking. "Buy better shoes," he mutters. Matsuo bows, deeper than necessary. It's said that in those years, Matsuo would walk an extra 10 blocks just to pass that alley, even if it made him late. And he was never late. But something about those men, their quiet, their certainty, etched itself into his idea of power. Teachers taught him ethics. The alley taught him leverage. Mainstream historians often point to Matsuo's academic records as evidence of his brilliance. And yes, they were excellent. He scored top marks in mathematics, literature, and civics. But what really set him apart was what he didn't write down. While other students memorized slogans, Matsuo memorized people. He knew which instructor hated being corrected, which janitor had a son applying to the police academy. He played the system like a koto, never loudly, never out of tune. One particular teacher, Mr. Takamori, once pulled him aside and asked bluntly, "You're not aiming to be a scholar, are you?" Seijiro replied, "No, sensei. I'm aiming to know what scholars whisper when they're unsure." That teacher retired 2 years later. His classmates didn't quite know what to make of him. He wasn't a loner, but no one felt close. He attended club meetings, but never led them. He smiled easily, but rarely laughed. A friend once said, "He's the kind of person you think you're joking with, until you realize he's already moved the conversation elsewhere." Still, when the student council elections came, Seijiro didn't campaign. He just won. There were no flyers, no rallies, just quiet conversations. A few influential classmates dropping hints, a teacher finding his name written on the board before ballots were even printed. By the time the votes were counted, no one remembered how they had decided, but everyone agreed it was inevitable. And that's the thing about Matsuo. He didn't force outcomes. He designed atmospheres. At home, his family lived modestly. His father had once been a railway administrator, dismissed after the war. His mother taught calligraphy to neighborhood girls. They weren't wealthy, but they kept their home spotless and their honor intact. Matsuo respected them, but he saw clearly the limits of integrity without influence. His father believed rules would rebuild Japan. Matsuo believed rules were only as useful as the people willing to bend them. In his final year of high school, a local council member visited the class for a lecture on civic duty. Matsuo asked 3 polite questions, each more precise than the last. The man smiled, clearly impressed. After class, he pulled Matsuo aside and offered him a summer internship, sorting documents, fetching tea. That councilman's name was Mori. He would later be indicted for bribery, though never convicted. Matsuo would never mention him in speeches, but every time someone asked how he got his start in politics, he'd smile and say, "I learned early to take notes when men start whispering." The following summer, Matsuo received a scholarship to a Tokyo Law University. On paper, it was for academic excellence, but many still believe that someone, possibly Mori, made a phone call. So what do you think? Did Matsuo earn that scholarship? Or was it the first brick in a pathway that had already been paved? When he arrived in Tokyo, everything changed. Kobe was narrow streets and neighborhood gossip. Tokyo was noise, ambition, and anonymity. Matsuo didn't flinch. He rented a room in a boarding house near Shinjuku, furnished with a cot, a desk, and a small radio. His neighbors never saw him waste time. He studied until midnight. But not just law. He studied people, again. The professor with gambling debts, the student leader whose father worked in the Ministry of Justice, the girl who knew everyone and knew who not to speak about. That girl, Yumi, once told a friend, "He never flirts, but somehow you still want to be the person he thanks." She would later disappear from school in her 3rd year. Rumors said she married a foreign diplomat. But in Matsuo's photo album, tucked deep behind pages of formal snapshots, there's a single candid of her in a cafe. No note. Just a coffee cup and a smile. In university debates, Matsuo rarely spoke unless necessary. But when he did, the room hushed. Not because he was passionate, but because he was precise. A visiting professor from Britain once said, "He debates like he's folding paper. Everything ends up sharp-edged and clean, and even then," whispers began, that he was connected, that his tuition came from private support, that someone in the upper chamber had taken an interest. Matsuo never confirmed or denied. He simply kept moving forward, collecting mentors like a lantern collects fireflies, without chasing them, just glowing steadily. By the time he graduated, 3 professors had already recommended him for junior posts in political offices. 2 minor roles he turned down. The 3rd, an assistant to a Tokyo assembly member, he accepted. Not because it paid better, but because it gave him access to building permits. Building permits, the least glamorous, most powerful tools in the city. And thus began the 2nd act. No longer a boy from Kobe, no longer a student with clean hands. Seijiro Matsuo stepped into Tokyo politics not with fanfare, but with a folder, a fountain pen, and a phone book full of remembered birthdays. It begins, as most dangerous arrangements do, with tea, not the kind served by clerks in plastic cups, but a proper ceremony. Tatami mats, painted screens, and a woman in a pale kimono who doesn't speak unless spoken to. The man Matsuo meets is not in office, nor in uniform, but the sleeves of his linen jacket ride slightly too high, just enough to reveal a faded mark where ink once told a longer story. He doesn't offer a name, and Matsuo doesn't ask. They sit in a narrow room above a koi pond in Meguro, where the water trickles like someone trying not to be overheard. The koi circle, lazy and slow, beneath floating blossoms. This meeting is not on any calendar. It wasn't arranged by a secretary. It was requested via a business card left on Matsuo's desk 3 days earlier, blank save for the faint embossing of a single chrysanthemum. "You've made friends," the man says after pouring the tea himself. "Friends who move very quickly. It's wise to know who's pulling the strings on your stage." Matsuo does not blink. He thanks him for the tea. The conversation moves delicately, like someone describing a storm without naming the wind. It isn't about money, yet everything about it is transactional. By the end of the meeting, a single sentence hangs between them. "You'll hear less resistance in future committee meetings." That's how it starts. Later that week, a bill Matsuo sponsors, one tied to infrastructure streamlining, passes with little objection. Two of its loudest critics call in sick. A third asks to be reassigned to agricultural affairs. No one says the word Yakuza, but everyone notices the silence. This isn't backroom politics. This is tatami politics. Folding, quiet, and highly absorbent. In the weeks that follow, Matsuo begins receiving calls from men he has never met but somehow knows. They don't introduce themselves. They simply say things like, "The crane you admired last week has arrived," or "The street by the Ginza Gallery won't be congested next month after all." These are not threats. They are favors offered with the eerie elegance of someone who already knows what you need. By this point, Matsuo is working out of a modest office in Minato Ward. 3 aides, a secretary, and 1 driver who used to work in Sapporo but doesn't talk about it. The walls are bare except for a map of Tokyo. Streets marked not with pins, but with pencil lines so light they vanish in daylight. Here's a historical note for context. By 1971, the Tokyo metropolitan government was dealing with increasing pressure to urbanize the outskirts. New train stations, public housing, utility contracts, all of it prime real estate, not just in land, but in influence. Whoever controlled the bidding process controlled the city's arteries. Matsuo quickly becomes the man to see, not because he can guarantee anything. He never promises, but he listens. And sometimes, a week later, things happen. Permits get rediscovered. Red tape gets inexplicably bypassed. Construction delays, poof, vanish. All this without Matsuo lifting a finger, at least not visibly. He starts to cultivate what some call a double language. One for official minutes, the other for unrecorded understanding. For example, if he says in a meeting, "We must ensure community voices are heard," his aides know to arrange a private dinner with certain neighborhood associations, 2 of which are politely affiliated with organized groups. If he says, "There's still some opacity in the vendor selection," someone knows to prepare an envelope, and yet he never accepts envelopes himself. This is crucial. Even years later, investigators would note the lack of physical evidence. Matsuo never handled cash, never signed unofficial agreements. Instead, he orchestrated connections, nudged meetings, suggested paths. He didn't walk through doors. He held them open for others and stepped back. Many people still think that this was the secret to his rise, that he was a man who said very little, but whose silences sounded like opportunities. Still, not everyone is comfortable. One of his junior aides, a recent graduate named Hiroshi, begins to feel the chill. During a lunch break, Hiroshi watches as 2 men in suits enter the office. No appointment, no names. They speak with Matsuo for 15 minutes, leave no documents, and exit smiling. The next day, Hiroshi receives a generous offer to transfer to Osaka's Civil Records Division. The offer isn't optional. Back in Tokyo, the koi pond meeting is never mentioned again. But once a month, a fresh tea set arrives at Matsuo's home, always from a different shop, always exquisitely wrapped. He donates most to shrines, keeps one. In the diet, his star continues to rise. His speeches are short but compelling. He champions efficiency, modernization, and civic responsibility. His proposals emphasize transparency, while his methods perfect the art of the opaque. And people love him, or at least they find him useful, which in politics is better than being loved. One autumn evening, Matsuo walks home instead of taking the car. The streets are slick with rain. A man approaches him near Shiba Park, tipping his hat low. "Thank you," the man says simply, handing him a folded fan. On the fan is the image of a single plum blossom, an old symbol from a long-defunct gang, now quietly merged into something larger. Matsuo accepts it, tucks it into his coat, and continues walking. What was agreed that night in the koi room was never written down. No contracts, no signed understandings. But a system was born. A system in which silence was traded for protection, access for obedience, favor for favor, endlessly looped. And in the background, Seijiro Matsuo sips his tea, smiles gently, and never names names. He doesn't need to. The apartment is unlisted. It sits on the 7th floor of an old reinforced concrete block in Minato, camouflaged among more glamorous high-rises. No name on the buzzer, no name on the mailbox. Even the elevator button has a soft grind to it, like it's been pressed often but never serviced. Matsuo rents it under a legal alias, a real name, but not his. A name that shows up in no campaign paperwork, no public statements. But the lease is paid on time, always in person, always in cash. Inside, it is sparse but elegant. Tatami floors in the bedroom, a low sofa in shades of charcoal, a desk made of black-stained cedar, scuffed just enough to look unimportant. The windows are shaded, not drawn, shaded, with rice paper that lets in the right kind of filtered light. Soft, evasive, flattering. It's not a place where Seijiro Matsuo lives. It's where he listens. Twice a week, never on the same days, never at the same times. This apartment becomes a whisper chamber. Men in suits arrive without briefcases, sometimes alone, sometimes with quiet assistants who speak only when spoken to. They don't stay long. 15 minutes, 20 at most. They sit, they talk, and Matsuo, always seated at the low table, doesn't take notes. He watches, he nods. Sometimes he pours tea. It's in this apartment that more decisions are made than in his official office. This is the place where a district boundary was redrawn to favor a friend's business expansion, where a shipping contract shifted from one bidder to another, where a community center mysteriously received emergency renovations after a fire that was never officially recorded. But this apartment doesn't just serve as a backroom. It's also a refuge, a space where Matsuo doesn't have to perform the stoic, measured grace he wears in public. Here, he allows himself the smallest indulgence, jazz. A turntable rests on a corner shelf, usually spinning quiet Miles Davis or Sadao Watanabe. Saxophone notes spill into the shadows like ink on wet paper. Visitors never comment on the music, but many glance at the records. One once asked why the album was on repeat. Matsuo just smiled. It doesn't repeat, it reminds. One night, a man in a gray suit arrives holding a gift box wrapped in plum silk. He bows deeper than most, then sets the box on the table without speaking. Matsuo opens it carefully. Inside, a lacquered wooden tray, black as oil, with a single ceramic cup in the center. Beneath the tray, a folded document, unsigned, unsealed, but unmistakably binding. The man doesn't explain. Matsuo doesn't ask. They share tea, finish it in silence, and the man leaves. 3 weeks later, a small legislative clause appears, buried deep in a larger housing reform bill. that reclassifies a certain industrial zone as mixed commercial. No one catches it, at least not until the foundation for a new office tower has already been poured. And who owns the development firm building it? That part remains foggy. The shareholder list reads like a directory of empty chairs. Many people still think that this apartment was Matsuo's greatest political weapon, not because it was hidden, but because it was ordinary. It didn't attract attention. It didn't brag, and therefore, it was never searched. So what do you think? Was his genius in what he built, or in what he allowed to remain invisible? One of the few people who ever visited the space twice was his driver, Fujita, a grizzled man with a stiff knee and a habit of humming old war songs. One night, after dropping off a visitor, Fujita lingers at the entrance. "Forgive me, sir," he says uncharacteristically, "but I've worked with a lot of people. Never seen someone keep such clean hands in such muddy water." Matsuo replies without looking up from his desk. "Clean hands don't stay clean by avoiding the mud, Fujita. They stay clean by knowing when not to splash." From that day forward, Fujita never asked again. The apartment also becomes a storage site of sorts. Not for money, Matsuo is far too meticulous for that, but for information. In the desk drawer, he keeps what looks like a child's school notebook. Spiral-bound, green cover, dog-eared edges, but inside are lists, dates, numbers, initials, and one-word descriptions. Doc, permit, brother, surgery. Each line is a story. Each story is a grip. No copies exist, no digital backups, and if someone were to break in, they'd likely dismiss it as an old planner, which is exactly the point. One entry, written neatly in blue ink, reads simply, "Ohashi, 5th floor, ask for Katsu, no tea." That line alone caused a regional delay in a security bill. But what's most notable about the apartment is what it lacks. There are no photos, no keepsakes, no awards, nothing that says, "This is who I am." Because that's not what this place is for. This place isn't for being. It's for enabling. One aide, who once made the mistake of arriving uninvited, was turned away at the door by a stranger he didn't recognize. The next day, he received a transfer offer. The day after that, he accepted. From this nondescript apartment, Seijiro Matsuo weaves strings across a city too large to notice the tension. And while public scandals flare and fade, while mayors come and go, his apartment remains quiet. The curtains never move, the postman never lingers, and inside, Matsuo sips tea, listens to jazz, and folds the city like a map. Some stories start in the shadows. This one starts with sunlight, filtered through koi pond ripples and cast in fragments on the sleeve of a linen jacket. It's a Wednesday in early spring, the kind of Tokyo morning where the city wears its best manners. The garden is part of a private estate tucked behind a Shibuya art museum. Not public, not listed, but protected by the kind of silence money buys after enough deals have been kept. Matsuo is led through the garden by a man known only as Tetsuya. No title, no job, but he has a face like polished granite and a way of walking that suggests he hasn't looked over his shoulder in years because no one would dare follow. He speaks softly, if at all. They arrive at the pavilion. Shoji screens slide open to reveal a tea table already set. The guest waiting there is not a politician. He is not a businessman, but he is important, enough that Matsuo bows a little deeper than usual. The man's name is never spoken aloud, but within the Yamaguchi Gumi, he's referred to simply as Oji-san, uncle. Not out of affection, but out of fear disguised as respect. The meeting lasts 17 minutes. No notes, no direct requests, just reflections. About community housing, about the fragility of licensing boards, about a certain bank branch in Fukuoka that has been struggling to find the right partners. When Matsuo leaves, he carries nothing. No folder, no handshake, no promise. Just the faint scent of sakura on his collar and a new understanding that something in his career has shifted, imperceptibly, but permanently. The conversation at the koi pond becomes one of those political urban legends. No cameras, no recordings, but everything after it. His rise in the diet, the unchallenged policies, the sudden quieting of his critics, feels like it radiates from that garden. Back in the city, small things begin to change. Matsuo starts arriving 5 minutes early to meetings he once barely attended. His memos become shorter, more cryptic. He stops using his office landline altogether, switching to handwritten notes delivered by his driver, Fujita, who begins wearing gloves even in summer. And then there's the call list. Not a phone list, but a rotation of visits, always in person, always brief. A young man with a scar on his left hand brings incense and leaves without speaking. A woman in a beige suit arrives with tea and stays exactly 12 minutes. An elderly gentleman known only as Kawaguchi-san begins visiting once a month to advise on rural development, though no such file exists under his name. If you had tried to piece together what was happening, you'd find nothing on paper, but you would feel it, like a shift in barometric pressure before a storm. One morning, Matsuo arrives at the Urban Planning Committee with a revised proposal tucked neatly into his folder. It's innocuous at first glance, streamlining logistics for small-scale development in suburban districts. No fanfare, no pushback. It passes with little discussion, but buried in the fourth clause is a phrase, expedited permits under partnership conditions. What are those conditions? The file doesn't say, but within 3 weeks, 3 construction firms linked to mid-tier Yakuza groups receive permits to develop shopping arcades near new commuter train stations. The timing is perfect. The arcades open just in time to capitalize on the rising housing influx. The contracts, awarded by third-party consultants no one can seem to trace. And Matsuo? He gives a speech about economic revitalization and smiles exactly once, for the cameras. Many people still think that the koi pond meeting marked the moment Matsuo stopped merely navigating the system and began shaping it. So what do you think? Was it a deal sealed with silence, or a pact born of shared necessity? Meanwhile, Matsuo's colleagues take notice. A veteran Diet member, Nakamura-san, begins to voice mild suspicions, comments about unusual alliances, raised eyebrows at budgets that balance too quickly. A whisper campaign begins, nothing direct, just a trail of coffee shop murmurs and sideways glances, until one day Nakamura falls. Literally, a misplaced step on a Diet building stairwell. Minor concussion. Nothing suspicious, except for the fact that he withdraws his concerns 2 days later and takes a medical leave of absence. He returns 6 months later with a book deal and no further questions. Matsuo sends flowers, white lilies, nothing extravagant. He understands optics. In private, he begins referring to certain meetings as gardens, as in, we'll settle that in the garden, or he's being too noisy for a garden. His aides learn quickly that garden means where things get decided before anyone notices. His home life remains a mystery. Unmarried, no children. Once seen with a cousin from Kyoto, but no further relatives ever photographed. Some say he lives in an apartment above a bookstore in Ebisu. Others claim he stays in different ryokan every month to avoid forming habits. The truth is simpler. He lives alone in a nondescript townhouse near Akasaka, registered under a trust. The neighbors say he's polite but distant, always leaves at the same time, never has visitors, sometimes returns late, always on foot, sometimes humming softly, jazz most likely. And so, the koi pond conversation becomes a pattern, then a practice, then a culture, one in which Matsuo is not just a politician, he is a threshold between policy and influence, between law and custom, between the names people say in committee and the ones they whisper over sake. And through it all, he remains maddeningly consistent, calm, precise, just slightly out of reach, like koi beneath the waterline, visible but never caught. The campaign trail is supposed to be chaos, late nights, smiling until your cheeks ache, nodding at strangers you hope will remember your name in the voting booth. For most candidates, it's a blur of cheap megaphones and folded handbills. But when Seijiro Matsuo runs for his first elected office, the experience looks different. Controlled, curated, eerily smooth. It's the spring of 1974. A seat in Tokyo's 4th district opens after the incumbent steps down to spend time with family. Matsuo announces his candidacy with little fanfare. No banners, no mascots. Just a brief press release printed in small type and handed to reporters outside the Tokyo Metropolitan Government Building. 2 weeks later, his face is everywhere. Posters appear overnight, plastered neatly and evenly across alley walls, shop shutters, and train stations. Not just in expected places, but in exactly the right ones. Above benches where seniors sit in the morning, near intersections with the longest red lights, even outside the karaoke bars frequented by night shift workers. Someone has mapped human behavior like a census and pasted Matsuo's face where the eye naturally rests. The campaign slogan? Integrity quietly. And here's the strange part. No one remembers volunteering to put up the posters, not officially. When questioned, Matsuo's campaign manager, a round-faced man with excellent posture, simply shrugs. We have supporters, but when pressed, no list is ever produced, no receipts, just polite smiles and cups of hot barley tea, and then the votes start rolling in. In several neighborhoods, particularly the older, denser ones, voter turnout is unusually high. Not just high, but precise. Dozens of blocks report 95% participation. Absentee ballots arrive in perfect alignment with campaign expectations. It's a statistical dream, or to some, a statistical impossibility. One local reporter notes that a significant number of ballots are cast under names belonging to residents who've been dead for years. When she brings it up to election officials, they glance at each other, then explain that errors sometimes occur in municipal record-keeping. When the final count is announced, Matsuo wins by a comfortable margin, too large to contest, too smooth to provoke investigation. The losing candidate, a boisterous ex-mayor named Tanaka, holds a press conference. I lost to a ghost, he says bitterly. A polite, smiling ghost. Within a year, Tanaka retires from public life and begins teaching calligraphy in Yamanashi. So what really happened? Many people still think that Matsuo's campaign wasn't rigged in the traditional sense. No ballot box stuffing, no intimidation. Instead, it was augmented, smoothed, facilitated by a quiet network of supporters who understood that a Matsuo win would be good for business. These supporters weren't campaign staff. They weren't even political. They were landlords, pachinko parlor owners, mid-level administrators in city offices who knew which forms to file when. And yes, perhaps a few men with sleeves rolled just high enough to show faded ink beneath the cuffs. The term ghost voters began circulating in Tokyo's political salons not long after the election, but it was always whispered, never written. After the victory, Matsuo doesn't celebrate. He thanks his team. He hosts a small dinner, 12 guests, no photos. One of the attendees, an elderly real estate developer, reportedly offers a quiet toast to smooth transitions and to cranes who land without ripples. The next day, Matsuo is already back in his office, reviewing urban zoning proposals. In his first public session as an elected official, he proposes a modest reform to streamline the permitting process for mixed-use buildings in underdeveloped sectors. It's framed as an economic booster, and it is, but it also allows certain properties, long held dormant by anonymous shell companies, to be activated. Within 6 months, 6 new developments begin construction on land that had remained untouched for decades, and the contractors? Let's just say they're familiar with construction and discretion. A particularly sharp-eyed bureaucrat in the Ministry of Infrastructure raises a concern about overlapping bids. But before the complaint makes it up the ladder, he receives a sudden transfer. Coastal Fisheries, Hokkaido. A quiet post with excellent views. Back in Tokyo, Matsuo remains untouchable. He attends every session, votes with perfect party discipline, speaks sparingly, but always with clarity. Even his critics struggle to accuse him of anything solid. There's just a sense, never confirmed, never proven, that he knows things before others do. His aides begin referring to him, half-jokingly, as the whisper beneath the gavel, and perhaps no moment captures this aura better than the day he arrives to a committee meeting already knowing which agenda items will be dropped. Before the chair announces the change. How did you know? A colleague asks afterward. I didn't, Matsuo says. I just assumed. It's an assumption that continues to serve him. But the ghost voter rumors never quite die. A former election observer writes an anonymous article in a niche political journal, hinting at unusual synchronization in ballot handling. The article is pulled 2 days later. The journal issues an apology, citing editorial misalignment. The author relocates to Singapore, starts a podcast about Southeast Asian tourism. So, what do you think? Did Matsuo win through legitimate charm and well-run logistics? Or was the hand of the underworld folding ballots alongside paper cranes? Either way, by the end of 1975, Seijiro Matsuo is no longer a shadow advisor. He is a Diet member. He wears the title like he wears his suits, precisely fitted, subtly impressive, and always one breath away from being misunderstood. A budget reform bill is rarely exciting. It's the kind of document that induces yawns even before it's printed. Spreadsheets, estimates, allocations, bureaucratic ballet without any music. But when Seijiro Matsuo introduces his first major piece of legislation in 1976, it glides through the Diet chambers with the grace of a seasoned dancer and a few unseen stagehands moving the scenery behind the curtain. The bill, officially titled the Metropolitan Efficiency and Development Adjustment Initiative, reads like a mid-tier accountant's daydream. Paragraphs on zoning reallocations, restructuring municipal grant flows, and reducing redundancy in public contract bidding. Not exactly headline material, but buried deep within its language is a particular clause, harmless at first glance, that expands access for subcontractors on public infrastructure projects. And it's that clause, Section 17B, that sets the table. Within weeks of the bill passing, a flurry of small construction firms, many previously considered too unqualified or undercapitalized, begin receiving city contracts. Pavement work in Setagaya, a community center in Itabashi, a sewer upgrade in Koto Ward. Each job just small enough not to attract media attention, just big enough to turn profit. All the firms share one thing: discreet ties to syndicates. Nothing proven, no registered affiliations, just faint trails, shared board members, sudden injections of capital from nameless investors, or office buildings rented from landlords with histories no one likes to print. And Matsuo? He issues a soft press statement praising new energy in the urban development sector. A vague compliment wrapped in administrative monotone. But those who pay attention, journalists, rival politicians, nervous clerks, begin to notice the pattern. One such observer is Noriko Ishida, a mid-career city planner with sharp eyes and a sharper pencil. She notices that several of the new firms receiving contracts list the same law firm as their legal representative. When she brings it up at a budget review meeting, her supervisor frowns. "That's not our concern, Ishida-san." "But not our concern," he repeats. 2 weeks later, she's promoted, relocated to a new post in Kyoto, overseeing historical site preservation. A lovely job, quiet, far from budgets. Many people still think that the real innovation of Section 17B wasn't corruption, it was elegance. So what do you think? Was it genius and policy craftsmanship, or just plausible deniability taken to new heights? The reform earns Matsuo polite applause in the press. Headlines call it refreshing pragmatism and a step toward leaner governance. One newspaper even dubs him the soft surgeon of public funds. He doesn't object to the nickname. Behind closed doors, however, those closest to him understand that Matsuo's true talent lies not in creating opportunity, but in allocating permission. He doesn't just write policy, he writes access. And yet, if you look at his bank records, you'll find nothing unusual. Modest salary, conservative investments, occasional gifts declared as per law, mostly calligraphy sets and imported teas, no offshore accounts, no unexplained wealth, because Matsuo doesn't take. He enables others to take, then collects the currency of influence. A more refined, less traceable form of power. One example. After the bill passes, a mid-sized construction company called Maruyama Holdings receives 4 consecutive contracts for sidewalk refurbishments across central Tokyo. The company's founder, a quiet man named Takanobu Maruyama, is spotted dining with a former Yakuza enforcer at a yakitori bar in Shinbashi. A reporter sees them, snaps a photo. That photo is never published. The reporter receives a sudden fellowship opportunity abroad. Paris, journalism ethics, fully funded. Back in the Diet, Matsuo is now regarded as something of a quiet tactician. His colleagues begin consulting him before proposing amendments, not because they fear him, but because his approval seems to grease the wheels. His support isn't loud, but it's effective. A nod from Matsuo can turn a debate into a formality. At one committee meeting, a newly elected representative asks, "Why does everyone defer to him? He's not even in leadership." The answer comes from a senior lawmaker who simply says, "Because no one knows more than he does about what isn't being said." Matsuo keeps his own notes, always in longhand, always on the same kind of ruled notepaper. One aide, tasked with archiving older files, once found a folder labeled Detours. Inside were memos, margin comments, and small diagrams of political relationships, none of which ever appeared in official documents. But they charted influence better than any organizational chart could. One page featured a single sentence: "The ones who sign are never the ones who benefit most." By the end of 1976, several of the small firms that benefited from the reform have grown. They begin bidding on larger projects. Their logos start appearing on city-sponsored banners. One sponsors a local baseball team. Another funds a scholarship. Clean faces, press-friendly, and always polite. But beneath that surface, familiar names, familiar favors. It's during this period that Matsuo begins hosting study sessions, intimate gatherings in private restaurants or rented villas. Not fundraisers, not official events, just discussions on policy impact, attended by developers, consultants, mid-level bureaucrats, and occasionally someone who used to be someone else. One such dinner, held in a ryote near Ueno, becomes the subject of quiet legend. The menu features seasonal fish. The conversation includes whispers about riverbank restoration, and one guest, never named, offers to absorb logistical friction for future projects. The next day, a scheduled audit of that guest's company is rescheduled indefinitely. Matsuo never confirms his presence at the dinner. But the restaurant owner later receives a government grant for historical preservation. By now, Matsuo has mastered the art of rearranging the city without anyone noticing the furniture has moved, and through it all, he remains unchanged. Gray suits, dark ties, clean briefcases, never flashy, never careless. He still drinks tea in the morning, still listens to jazz in the evening, still walks with the unhurried gait of a man who's never rushed and never cornered. He visits his old apartment in Minato less frequently now. Instead, he meets in a variety of places: a borrowed conference room, a temple courtyard, the back room of a stationery shop. Locations change. Intentions don't. The budget reform bill becomes a case study in law schools 5 years later. How to enact change without resistance. But they never mention Matsuo by name. He prefers it that way. There's always one. The person who stays too long at the edge of the story, who notices things others pretend not to, who asks the kind of questions that can't be walked back once spoken aloud. In Matsuo's world, that person is Satomi Kuroda. She's not a politician, not a reporter, just a secretary, his longest-serving one, in fact. Hired in 1972 when Matsuo was still navigating the hallways of junior appointments and minor advisory roles. She was 26 then, with round glasses and an encyclopedic memory, the kind who remembers your blood type, your favorite ink color, and the exact time your mother called last Wednesday. For nearly 4 years, Satomi handled Matsuo's schedule, correspondence, and crisis buffering. She wrote his polite refusals, fielded calls he'd never return, and ensured every meeting began exactly 2 minutes late, just enough to appear important, but not dismissive. But in 1977, something changes. She notices the patterns tightening, the meetings becoming shorter, but heavier. Visitors no longer introduce themselves. Envelopes arrive, sealed in plastic sleeves. Packages are never signed for. And Matsuo, once gently distant, begins keeping his briefcase within reach even during tea breaks. Then one day, she finds it. Not money, not blackmail, just a folder, mislabeled, almost lazily. Facilities, MISC. Inside are floor plans, not of government buildings, but of cafes, bathhouses, and municipal storage lots, all recently renovated, all funded by public-private joint development grants, and all managed, at least partially, by the same 3 construction groups. She cross-references, checks ledger entries. Something doesn't add up, so she asks, "Sir, are these sites under community contracts?" Matsuo looks up from his reading, blinks once, then says calmly, "Why do you ask, Satomi-san?" She hesitates. Some of the routing seems inconsistent with standard procedure. I thought perhaps there was an amended directive, one I missed. A pause. Then Matsuo smiles. "No, nothing amended. Just properly allocated." He doesn't scold her, doesn't threaten. But the next morning, a representative from the personnel office arrives unannounced. They shake her hand, offer her a new position, Director of Regional Affairs Coordination, a promotion, double the salary, relocation to Nagasaki. There is no refusal. The farewell party is quiet. Matsuo thanks her for her service, gifts her a calligraphy set. She bows deeply, says nothing, but on the flight to Nagasaki, she keeps thinking about the folder, the floor plans, the faint handwriting in the margins that looked nothing like her own. Many people still think that Satomi's transfer was the last close call Matsuo ever had inside his office. So what do you think? Was her departure a polite reshuffling or a necessary recalibration? From that point on, Matsuo changes the structure of his staff. Rotations increase. No one stays longer than 18 months. Tasks are segmented. Access is limited. Even routine memos are now routed through layers of aides, each instructed to erase their own drafts once finalized. It's not paranoia, it's architecture. He builds a fortress, not of walls, but of habits. Routines so methodical, so mind-numbingly dull. They deter curiosity by sheer inertia. One new assistant, an eager graduate named Shuhei, tries to ask about a mysterious visitor seen entering Matsuo's office late one evening. The next week, Shuhei is reassigned to the tax office in Chiba, a quiet place full of numbers, perfect for someone inquisitive about patterns. But outside the office, the walls grow even thicker. The rise in influence Matsuo enjoys post-1977 is remarkable. His budget proposals pass with near unanimity. His policy suggestions are cited in newspapers as examples of modern governance. A foreign diplomat even refers to him as Japan's quiet minister, yet he never holds a cabinet position. He refuses each offer. When asked why, Matsuo always gives the same answer. I serve better as a hinge than as a handle, a poetic answer and a revealing one. He prefers to facilitate, not command, influence, not enforce. And in this, he is unbeatable. Meanwhile, those who once asked questions fall into comfortable silence. Satomi Kuroda's name surfaces again only once, in a footnote of a policy journal, anonymously quoting a former government secretary about unusual discretion in resource allocation. The author of that journal is later hired by a think tank based in New York. He moves quietly. At the same time, the properties tied to those original floor plans continue to flourish. One becomes a members-only spa. Another, a private business club with no signage, but an excellent French chef. The third is quietly acquired by a cultural preservation group and transformed into a museum that never opens to the public, but is rented for events. And the contractors? Their portfolios expand. Their names stay off headlines. Their influence grows, because behind every bidding process, behind every zoning vote, there's a whisper. And that whisper sounds a lot like Matsuo. Once, over tea with a visiting professor, he's asked directly, "Don't you ever worry that someone will expose your arrangements?" Matsuo pauses, then replies, "No one exposes the wind. They just complain when it shifts." The streets of Shinjuku at midnight are a different language. Neon flickers in half-syllables. Vending machines hum like tired monks. And the trains keep running even when the conversation shouldn't. It's not a place where politicians are expected to be. Certainly not alone. Certainly not without press or bodyguards. But on a humid summer night in 1978, Seijiro Matsuo steps out of his car on a back street behind the Kabukicho district and tells his driver, "Wait 30 minutes. Fujita doesn't ask why, he never does." Matsuo walks a few blocks and turns into a narrow alley between two karaoke bars. No fanfare, no nameplates, just a rusted door behind a ramen shop and a man standing beside it, arms folded, eyes steady. The man doesn't speak, just nods once and steps aside. Inside, the air is cooler. Not from air conditioning, just less expectation. The walls are covered in old movie posters. The booth seats are worn, and the lighting seems engineered to forget your face the moment you turn away. At the back, a round table. 4 men already seated. 3 wear suits, creased in ways that suggest they only dress up for specific kinds of negotiations. The 4th, older, wears a white shirt with the sleeves rolled high enough to show a faded dragon coiled around his forearm. He gestures for Matsuo to sit. No one introduces anyone. There's no point. This isn't a meeting. It's a reckoning. "You're moving too fast," the older man says, sipping from a glass of clear liquid that definitely isn't water. "Some of our friends are nervous." Matsuo doesn't blink. They should be. Fast tides pull only the anchored. One of the younger men chuckles. The others don't. There's a pause. So quiet, the distant clack of mahjong tiles in the next room becomes loud. Then the real conversation begins. Not in accusations, in offers. The Yakuza, you see, aren't just gangsters. Not by the late 70s. They're businessmen with old customs and sharper calculators. And some of them have grown wary of Matsuo. Not because he's dishonest, but because he's becoming too clean to control. He's streamlined the permit process, yes, but in doing so, he's reduced the number of middlemen. And middlemen are where favors grow fat. Some of the old hands feel forgotten. The dragon-sleeved man says, not unkindly. Matsuo listens, then places a folded sheet of paper on the table. It's not a threat. It's a zoning map. Updated. 3 new projects, same arrangement, but fewer hands means more for each. No one touches the paper, not yet. Finally, the man with the dragon smiles faintly. "You're learning to offer before being asked. That's a useful habit." They drink, nothing more is said. 30 minutes later, Matsuo returns to the car. Fujita starts the engine but doesn't speak. The next morning, 3 real estate firms receive approval letters, hand-delivered by a courier service not listed in any public registry. 1 week later, a 4th firm is quietly removed from a city development program. No explanation given. But insiders say the removal followed a late-night phone call from someone very polite. This, right here, is Matsuo's genius. He never threatens, he replaces. A building permit denied? Another, equally valuable one appears in a nearby ward. A donor with doubts suddenly finds his daughter's university tuition mysteriously covered by a scholarship fund. A newspaper editor too curious receives a confidential government report, exclusive, on an entirely unrelated scandal. He gives breadcrumbs, never whole bread. Many people still think that this meeting in Shinjuku marked the moment Matsuo moved from partner to equal in the eyes of the underworld. So what do you think? Did he buy peace that night? Or did he broker a new arrangement entirely? Back in his office, Matsuo marks the zoning map with 3 red dots and locks it away in a drawer labeled Public Use Archive. Only he knows the drawer key is kept under the bonsai tree by the window, inside a ceramic frog. Later that month, during a parliamentary luncheon, he sits beside a foreign trade minister. The conversation turns to Tokyo's urban expansion. The minister asks how Matsuo balances development with heritage. Matsuo replies, smiling, "We don't balance, we blend, like proper tea." It's quoted in the papers the next day. Readers applaud his poetry. Critics mutter about vagueness. No one realizes the line is a nod to the very practice that now defines his method. Nothing ever truly removed. Nothing ever truly separate. Even his rivals begin to concede that opposing Matsuo is like arguing with gravity. Quiet, unseen, and absolutely effective. One young councilman, frustrated by Matsuo's unchecked rise, attempts to dig. Files a request for transparency on several of Matsuo's supported development programs. The request is denied, then approved, then delayed, then redirected to a subcommittee that hasn't met in 3 years. The councilman gives up, moves on to other causes, but his assistant receives an unexpected grant to study city planning abroad. Rome, 4 months. Very generous, the assistant says. Indeed. That autumn, Matsuo is nominated for a regional leadership award, one of those polite honors used to keep the well-behaved even better behaved. He accepts it, smiles, gives a short speech. The award sits in a glass case in the Diet lobby. He never visits it. He doesn't need reminders of what he's built, because what he's built isn't a legacy. It's a mechanism, and in that quiet mechanism, every handshake from Kabukicho to Nagatacho is timed, oiled, and tuned. Every political machine needs a cog that disappears at the right moment. For Seijiro Matsuo, that cog is a single sheet of paper, filed, misplaced, and then vanished entirely from the Diet archives in the winter of 1979. It's nothing special at first glance. A summary memo tied to an infrastructure subcommittee, 5 paragraphs, mostly jargon, a few lines about reevaluating contract eligibility for emerging firms, buried deep in the 3rd page. But those lines point, indirectly but unmistakably, to a recommendation Matsuo had ghostwritten, suggesting that certain contractors be given discretionary exceptions to standard competitive bidding procedures. In simpler terms, a shortcut for people he liked. The memo is drafted, reviewed by an intern, initialed by a junior secretary, and then gone. When an opposition member, Ishikawa-san, requests the document during a routine audit, the clerk simply shrugs. Never submitted, he says. But Ishikawa had seen it, just once. A blurry copy, handed to him by a colleague who had second thoughts. He remembered the phrase, provisional trust certification. Remembered it because no one could explain what it meant. Ishikawa tries to escalate. He sends letters, raises concerns, even drafts a formal motion to investigate potential procedural anomalies. But before he submits it, a quiet conversation is requested. Not with Matsuo, but with someone who simply introduces himself as Kawaguchi from planning. The meeting takes place in a quiet soba shop in Kanda. Kawaguchi eats slowly, wipes his mouth after every bite, never once looks directly at Ishikawa. You're young, he says eventually. Ambitious, but maybe not ambitious in the right direction. Ishikawa doesn't respond. Kawaguchi continues. There are many ways to leave a mark. Some are on paper, others are in who doesn't get hurt. The next day, Ishikawa revises his motion, removes all references to the missing memo. 3 months later, he announces he won't seek re-election, says he wants to spend more time with family. His family, for what it's worth, has already moved to Hokkaido. And the memo? Still gone. Many people still think this event, so minor, so forgettable, was one of the clearest signs of Matsuo's quiet control over not just what was done, but what could be known. So what do you think? Was the missing memo an act of bureaucratic clumsiness? Or was it erased like a chalk mark before rain? Inside his private files, Matsuo has a note, not the memo itself. That would be too risky. Just a slip of paper marked with 3 dots, a date, and a short line. Next time, don't draft. After this, Matsuo's style becomes even more elliptical. He stops writing first drafts altogether, only offers suggestions verbally. His aides learn to use language like vapor, sentences that drift and dissolve, leaving meaning behind, but no mass. Proposals begin with phrases like, perhaps there's an angle we haven't considered, or it might be interesting to explore what other cities have done. In committee meetings, Matsuo rarely leads discussions anymore. He sits slightly back from the table, observes. And at the exact moment when a decision begins to tilt, he leans forward, adjusts his glasses, and says, "If consensus is forming, perhaps we should not delay." That's it. But suddenly, consensus exists. The only person who ever challenges him directly during this period is an independent representative named Etsuko Wada, a former academic, unafraid of rank or decorum. During one particularly tense session, she accuses Matsuo of constructing policy with ghost hands. A ripple moves through the chamber. Matsuo doesn't blink. He simply replies, "Sometimes the truest architects are those who remain behind the curtain, not because they hide, but because they do not require applause. Applause follows anyway." Wada leaves the Diet the following year, citing disillusionment with performative governance. She later writes a memoir titled Paper Castles. It does modestly well. Matsuo never comments on it. But in the margins of one of his policy journals, a note appears. She saw more than most. Meanwhile, the missing memo becomes a kind of legend. Newer aides joke about it, call it the one that got away. Some claim it never existed. Others claim it was folded into a different bill entirely, its essence diffused like ink in water. But those who've been around long enough know better. They've seen the pattern. When documents vanish, when names disappear from minutes, when votes pass too quickly to trace, Matsuo is always near. Not as a forger, not as a fixer, but as a curator of reality. One of his closest confidants, a senior minister who once shared a school dorm with him, puts it best. Matsuo doesn't bury things. He makes the ground shift until the past falls through, and in this, he is never sloppy. If a paper is dangerous, he does not destroy it. He ensures it is never needed. If a voice is loud, he does not silence it. He finds another platform, louder still, and redirects the crowd. If a vote might fail, he does not buy it. He delays the meeting until the failure becomes fatigue. Even his handwriting changes, subtly, over time. Older notes are crisp and deliberate. Later ones, slanted, faint, almost designed not to be read. Because Matsuo has learned the final lesson of influence. If you must leave a mark, make it in fog. It's a warm April evening in 1980 when the cars begin to pull up one by one, their engines humming softly in the darkness outside a discreet Ryote in Akasaka. The traditional restaurant is tucked beneath a canopy of cherry trees, their blossoms scattering onto the cobblestones like confetti after a silent celebration. The staff is quiet, rehearsed, gliding between paper screens and tatami mats. Everything has been prepared down to the grain of rice and the pour of the sake. The guest list is unspoken but unmistakable. There are no press releases, no photographers, and yet the event is referred to, years later, as Tokyo's quietest donor dinner. Matsuo arrives precisely at 7:43 p.m., not a moment earlier, not a moment later. He's dressed in his usual dark suit, carrying nothing but a folded handkerchief and the faintest scent of green tea. He greets no one formally, makes no introductions. He simply takes his place at the far end of the long, low table, where a single cushion has been set slightly apart from the others. The seating arrangement tells the story. To his right, a well-known real estate developer. To his left, a logistics executive who once managed Tokyo's entire bus network and now heads a consulting firm. Across from him, the chair of a powerful regional bank and a silent man with polished shoes and no name tag. The dinner itself is simple. Seasonal sashimi, salt-grilled ayu, bamboo shoots with miso. No menus, no speeches, only envelopes. They appear like clockwork, slipped discreetly beneath ceramic dishes, folded under the lacquer trays. even left in the restroom between the hand towels. Not bulging with cash, of course. This is 1980. No one is that clumsy. Instead, the envelopes contain donation pledges, business cards with handwritten notes, copies of project proposals with key sections highlighted. Some are sealed with calligraphy, others left deliberately open. The total sum pledged that evening is never tallied aloud, but everyone at the table understands. Matsuo's next campaign is funded. Completely. Quietly. And not just funded, but endorsed. Because these aren't just donors. They're gatekeepers, owners of highways, hospitals, and hotels. Some with public titles, some with none at all. Each has a stake in the machinery Matsuo operates, and a shared interest in ensuring it runs without noise. At no point does Matsuo ask for anything. He nods. He listens. Occasionally, he raises his cup and offers a brief, "Your support continues to be meaningful." That's all. Many people still think that this dinner marked the moment Matsuo moved from being a clever tactician to a central pillar of Tokyo's unspoken power structure. So, what do you think? Was it a dinner to raise funds, or a ritual to reaffirm control? One of the servers that evening, a woman in her 40s who later left the Ryote and opened a bakery, recalled that she never once heard anyone raise their voice. "It was like watching monks," she said. But monks who wear Italian shoes. She also remembered the man at the far end, the one without a name tag, slipping a second envelope into a different coat pocket before leaving. What was in that envelope? No one knows. But 2 weeks later, the Ministry of Transport altered its urban planning recommendations to favor a multi-use complex project backed by one of Matsuo's known associates. Coincidence? Perhaps. Matsuo never comments publicly on the dinner. When a journalist attempts to ask about it during a press gaggle 2 days later, Matsuo tilts his head slightly and says, "I believe in meaningful conversations, not performative ones." The journalist moves on, and the donations? All declared, all legal, all meticulously logged in campaign records that list them as community support contributions. Even the bank transfers are clean. Funds wired through standard channels, traced to family trusts, legacy firms, and shell companies so old their founders are names no one says anymore. The only hint of something unusual is the consistency of the giving. Every donor gives just below the threshold that would trigger additional scrutiny. Every time. Year after year. That level of coordination doesn't happen by chance. Back at the Ryote, as the guests leave one by one, a black car idles near the back entrance. The man with no name tag slips inside without a word. Matsuo remains seated for a few more minutes, eyes closed, fingertips gently touching the rim of his teacup, not savoring, calculating. He finally rises, thanks the staff with a bow, and steps out into the cool night air. Outside, the cherry blossoms fall silently. No fanfare, no applause, just the soft hush of petals on pavement, like secrets settling into place. Kyoto, summer 1981. The hall is old, fragrant with cedar and centuries of whispers. Paper lanterns swing gently under fans that do more for form than function. A modest crowd has gathered, mostly local politicians, mid-level bureaucrats, and a few members of the press who are already sweating through their notepads. On the stage stands Seijiro Matsuo, dressed not in his typical charcoal gray, but a lighter summer suit, almost ivory, the color of tea leaves dried in the sun. He bows, slowly, holds it a breath longer than expected, then straightens, clears his throat, and begins. Cities must breathe, that's how it starts. And for the next 12 minutes, he delivers what will come to be known, at least in select circles, as the broker's speech. a speech that drifts gently through ideas of infrastructure, tradition, economic rhythm, and the delicate dance between progress and preservation. He never once names the syndicates, never once references the backroom dealings. But those who listen carefully hear the message. When we forget that growth must include silence, we begin to drown in noise we cannot trace back to reason. It is, on the surface, a call for thoughtful policy making, but underneath it's a warning to the old guard, the impatient reformers, and even the men with inked backs sitting in private booths just outside the venue. The phrase that sticks in everyone's minds, though, is this one: we must not confuse the hand that pours the tea with the one that owns the kettle. What does it mean? That depends on who you ask. A progressive columnist interprets it as a veiled critique of bureaucratic overreach. An academic calls it a poetic lament for legislative opacity. And one mid-tier oyabun, quoted anonymously years later, says, "He was just reminding everyone who set the table." Matsuo ends the speech with a short bow, exits the stage, and disappears before the applause fully begins. Outside, a black car is already waiting. Inside, it is a man named Sugimoto, a middleman with a reputation for cleaning up political messes before they stain too many shirts. He doesn't speak until they're halfway back to the station. "You stirred the nest," he says. Matsuo replies, "Only the wasps." Sugimoto grunts. In the weeks that follow, things begin to shift subtly around the edges of Matsuo's circle. A longtime ally in the Ministry of Housing announces early retirement. A developer once tied to a suspicious permit abruptly withdraws from a downtown project, and a reform-minded assemblywoman who had privately voiced plans to challenge Matsuo's influence is offered a prestigious post abroad. London, cultural envoy, a dream job. She accepts. Behind the scenes, the Kyoto speech has done its job. It reminds those watching that Matsuo is not merely surviving within the system, he is engineering it. Every word chosen, every pause calibrated. The applause was polite. The consequences, precise. The press runs quotes from the event for 3 days. But no one seems quite able to explain why the speech feels heavier than its words suggest. One editorial reads, "Matsuo said little, but his silence, as always, was a kind of gravity." Many people still think this speech was a turning point, a line drawn gently in sand, daring the tide to blur it. So, what do you think? Was he reasserting dominance, or issuing a veiled olive branch? Back in Tokyo, a framed calligraphy scroll is delivered to Matsuo's office. No name attached, just a short phrase, inked in bold strokes. The mirror does not smile back. Matsuo places it on the wall above his desk. Visitors ask what it means. He simply replies, "It helps me keep my face clean." That autumn, Matsuo proposes a revision to a civic ethics code, not to strengthen it, but to clarify its boundaries. The new language offers greater discretion to city councils on what constitutes undue influence. It passes without resistance. No headlines are written about it, because the language is so dry, so procedural, no one wants to bother. But the effect, immediate. Oversight becomes interpretation. Interpretation becomes habit. Habit becomes silence. And in the midst of this, Matsuo's name disappears further from the text of the laws he shapes. He becomes a phantom author, never listed, always known. His staff begins referring to certain files as ghost drafts. When asked, one aide jokes, "He writes like mist, there, one moment, then woven into the weather." Meanwhile, Matsuo continues his routine. Early tea, silent garden walks, fewer public appearances, more private sessions. But the Kyoto speech lingers. In quiet corners of influence, people still speak of it in half smiles and eyebrow raises. Not because of what was said, but because of who seemed to listen. A month later, at a private shrine outside Nara, 3 mid-tier syndicate members gather for a seasonal ritual. After the offerings, one of them, who had quietly financed a city development plan, leans in and says, "I think he just reminded us that we're still eating at his table." The others nod. They never say his name. They don't have to. The scandal begins, as many of them do, not with a bang, but with a fan, a paper fan to be precise, left on a table, photographed once, published once, then gone. It's the summer of 1982. Tokyo is between fiscal debates, and Matsuo is attending a charity event in Ginza, a fundraiser for educational reform hosted by an innocuous-sounding cultural foundation. The kind of event where people sip cold tea, applaud politely, and leave with more business cards than opinions. Matsuo is there in a navy blue suit, calm, silent, drifting through the crowd like a man half remembering a poem. A journalist from a local magazine, Shinso Journal, mid-tier circulation, known for digging a little too deep, snaps a few candid shots of the event for a Faces of Governance spread. Light stuff, faces, smiles, handshakes. But when the photos return from development, one detail catches the editor's eye. In one shot, Matsuo is seated beside a city councilman, gently fanning himself with a white uchiwa. Innocent enough, except for the design printed on it. A crest, stylized, circular, unmistakably old. To most, it's just an ornate graphic. But to those who know, it's an emblem used by a now-defunct regional Yakuza clan, the Kaisai Kai, once absorbed into a larger syndicate known for its construction advisory services. The image gets published, small, grainy, on page 14, just once. The issue vanishes within days, not sold out, recalled. The magazine issues a quiet correction the following week. The fan in question was decorative and bears no known affiliation. No apology. Just a flat, bureaucratic backpedal. But by then, the phone lines have already lit up. A whistleblower within the planning department contacts a friend in the editorial team. Claims he's seen that same crest on envelopes. Discreet, thick, hand-delivered to the zoning review office. Claims Matsuo once signed off on a meeting with a consultant, known only by an alias who used that very symbol in a personal seal. The story doesn't make it to print. The whistleblower resigns. The friend in editorial transferred to the entertainment section, and the photo archived. Still, the image spreads, quietly, in back rooms, in whispers. Photocopied versions start circulating among junior aides and city clerks. One copy makes it to the office of A.G. Morimoto, a deputy chief inspector tasked with monitoring organized crime infiltration into civic contracts. He pins it to a board for 2 days, then removes it. Why? Because Matsuo shows up, not unannounced, not aggressively, just politely. A lunch meeting. Tea. A conversation about ethics, balance, and the fragility of institutional trust. By the end of the meal, Morimoto agrees to focus his attention on more active risk factors. Later that year, his office issues a report citing no present indication of systemic collusion between organized elements and municipal policymakers. Many people still think the photo was a mistake, an accidental exposure of something deeply intentional. So, what do you think? Was it merely a design on a fan, or a nod to those who already understood the choreography? Matsuo never comments on it, but a month after the incident, during a casual policy forum, he makes an offhand remark. Symbols are dangerous things. They mean little until people choose to see meaning in them, and by then, it's often too late. The room laughs politely. The aide who handled the fan that night, an intern named Shunji, quietly leaves the political scene. He opens a stationery shop in Sendai. When asked about his time in government, he simply says, I learned to recognize the weight of paper. Meanwhile, Matsuo tightens the threads. He institutes a new policy. No decorative objects, fans, pins, calligraphy scrolls, allowed at public events unless pre-approved. It's framed as a branding initiative. Most assume it's an aesthetic choice, but the reality is sharper. He's learned that it's not the words that betray you. It's the ornaments. The speech is monitored, the actions debated, but the symbols, the fans, the crests, the folds in the sleeve, those slip past the filters, and he won't be caught by a symbol again. From then on, his presence becomes even more minimal, photographed only when necessary, always in controlled lighting, always with plain objects. When he does use a fan, it's blank, white, featureless, almost aggressively unmemorable. One diet colleague jokes, "You could paint him out of a photo and no one would know what was missing." And that, of course, is the point. But deep inside one of Matsuo's private folders, stored in a locked drawer behind a cabinet of zoning files, is a copy of that photo, the one with the fan, on the back, in Matsuo's neat handwriting. "Remember, winds leave patterns." In the farthest corner of a dim, wood-paneled restaurant in Ikebukuro, one that doesn't take reservations, doesn't list a phone number, and doesn't show up on city maps, 3 men kneel across from Seijiro Matsuo as he lifts a small ceramic cup to his lips. The sake is warm, slightly sweet, and poured by the host himself. Tonight is not just dinner. Tonight is a ritual. The table is quiet, save for the occasional scrape of ceramic against lacquer. No phones, no aides, no schedules. Just 3 men, 2 bottles, and one decision that none of them will speak aloud. After the 3rd cup, the eldest of the 3 men, wearing a suit slightly too tight across the shoulders, reaches into his coat. From within, he pulls out a small black box wrapped in indigo cloth. He places it on the table between them without a word. Matsuo does not open it. He knows what's inside. A sake cup. Unmarked. Modest. But its significance outweighs any document, any contract, any whispered agreement in the dark. The man bows low. Then the others do too. Matsuo inclines his head. Not fully, not ceremonially, but just enough to acknowledge the weight of what's being offered. No words are needed. This is Oyabun Kobun in its quietest form. Not a blood pact, not a tattooed initiation. Just the recognition of belonging, a signal, a nod, that Matsuo is now family, in the eyes of a mid-tier syndicate with deep reach into construction, logistics, and, more discreetly, campaign consulting. The ritual lasts less than 10 minutes. There's no toast, no handshake, only the cup, the nods, and the silence that follows. When the meal ends, Matsuo wraps the box in the same cloth and tucks it gently into the folds of his coat. As he steps into the Tokyo night, he doesn't look back. The following morning, 3 separate contract approvals slide across desks in the Metropolitan Planning Bureau. All signatures are accounted for. All stamps official. But the speed of movement, uncharacteristically swift, and the firms awarded those contracts, all subsidiaries, well disguised but traceable, to the syndicate that just welcomed Matsuo into their extended circle. It's never announced. There's no photograph. But suddenly, the language in Matsuo's memos changes. Words like coordination, delegated authority, and aligned execution appear more frequently. Efficiency becomes his new mantra, and it spreads. Within weeks, the offices surrounding his own begin using his phrasing. Staffers mimic his cadence. Other politicians, some aware of the ritual, some not, start drafting proposals that seem tailored to match Matsuo's, because alignment in Tokyo politics is contagious. Many people still think this informal induction, marked the point where Matsuo became more than a political broker. He became a bridge between suits and syndicates, between regulation and reputation. So what do you think? Was this his way of gaining protection or offering protection in return? Back in his home, Matsuo places the sake cup on a small shelf above his desk. He doesn't display it. It's not there for show. It's just there, and when he glances at it, once, briefly, each evening, it's not reverence. It's inventory, because Matsuo doesn't romanticize bonds. He tracks them. One night, while sharing a quiet drink with a visiting prefectural governor, Matsuo is asked what he values most in politics. Not votes, he says, not even loyalty. He sips his sake. Continuity. The governor nods, though he doesn't quite understand. But continuity to Matsuo means something specific. It means that when a councilman is removed, his replacement already understands the rhythm. It means that when a journalist investigates too deeply, the article gets flagged before the first draft is submitted. It means that when a scandal does break, and one always does, it erupts just far enough away not to touch him. This is what the sack cup guarantees, not impunity, resilience. And Matsuo, ever the architect, begins reinforcing his house. His policies start including more generous language for public-private partnerships. He defends programs that enhance local contractor participation. He praises grassroots efficiency, which in Tokyo often means letting trusted actors handle business quietly. He even floats a proposal, never passed, but heavily discussed, that would allow anonymous donors to contribute to district improvement funds. The opposition barks, newspapers grumble, but the proposal still circles committee for 6 months before quietly expiring without vote. Its message, however, is received. Matsuo's allies grow more confident. A construction tycoon publicly thanks him during a televised interview, just vague enough to pass scrutiny, just warm enough to confirm allegiance. Matsuo says nothing in response. But that night, the sake cup is dusted, turned slightly, and placed exactly 4 centimeters to the left. His only indulgence, a repositioning of memory, a reminder that in Tokyo's complex ecosystem of favors and formality, a cup of sake offered with silence can change the shape of an entire city. And on the streets below, the traffic keeps moving, the buildings keep rising, and the man at the center of it all walks steadily forward, with a cup in his coat and no one truly beside him. The morning train to Fukuoka hums along the coast like a lullaby wrapped in steel. It glides past fishing villages, warehouses, and quiet stretches of farmland. Most passengers nap, their briefcases nestled beside their knees. But in Car 7, Seat 3D, Seijiro Matsuo sits upright, a crisp copy of the Asahi Shimbun folded neatly in his lap, and a small envelope tucked between its pages. He hasn't traveled this far south in years, not publicly at least. Officially, he's on a research tour, a fact-finding mission regarding regional transportation needs. But no aides accompany him. No camera crews trail his steps. Just Matsuo, his coat, and a small black notebook with a cracked spine. The train arrives at Hakata Station at 11:38 a.m. on the dot. Matsuo disembarks without hesitation, merges with the crowd, and walks calmly to the taxi queue. He gives no address, just shows the driver a piece of paper. The driver nods once, shifts into gear, and pulls away. An hour later, they're deep in the coastal outskirts, where the neon signs fade and old pachinko parlors become rusting fossils of brighter times. The taxi pulls up in front of a low, square building with weather-worn wood and tinted windows. From the outside, it looks like a bathhouse. Inside, it's something else. Matsuo is led past tiled corridors and a small koi pond that's seen better filtration days. Finally, he's ushered into a private room where 4 men wait. The room smells faintly of tobacco, sandalwood, and cold ambition. The meeting lasts 42 minutes. The topic? A tourism initiative. On paper. In practice, something more elastic. The plan is simple. Fukuoka, like much of Kyushu, has been aching for development. The city council wants jobs. The public wants revenue. The land near the ferry port is underused. Enter Marutaka Leisure Holdings, a shell company with murky funding lines and a surprisingly detailed blueprint for an entertainment district targeting foreign visitors. Hotels, arcades, restaurants, and a few floors underground, private clubs. Matsuo listens, sips tea, takes no notes. Then, as the eldest of the men lays out the projected numbers, tourist foot traffic, estimated revenue, and discreet policing guarantees, Matsuo finally speaks. The licenses will have to be framed as cultural, a nod. They've already prepared the necessary language, and you'll need to involve a foundation, something educational. To offset press suspicion, another nod, already filed. Matsuo finishes his tea, leaves the room. The decision has been made. Many people still think that Matsuo's visit to Fukuoka planted the roots of Japan's modern, gray leisure economy. So what do you think? Was he enabling criminal enterprise, or giving a struggling city the lifeline no one else would risk? By the time he returns to Tokyo, the wheels are already turning. A regional grant is restructured. A visiting economist from Osaka writes a glowing op-ed about local cultural revitalization, and a small paragraph buried in a transportation policy update quietly reclassifies certain ferry district zones as special mixed-use commerce zones. No one notices, no one asks, because that's how Matsuo operates. Not with announcements, but with invitations disguised as efficiency. The trip earns him no headlines, but in Fukuoka, people remember. 3 months later, a councilman delivers a toast at a gala and says, "We thank Matsuo-sensei for helping us see our shoreline's true potential." He doesn't elaborate. He doesn't need to. Back in Tokyo, Matsuo files a trip summary. 1 paragraph, typed, double-spaced. It mentions insightful local perspectives and opportunities for cultural commerce. Nothing more. He places a check mark in his black notebook, then tears out the page, burns it, flushes the ashes. Later that evening, in his apartment, he writes a short line in longhand on a slip of rice paper. Even low tides leave footprints. He folds the paper once, slips it behind the framed photo of a Kyoto temple that no one ever comments on. The Fukuoka initiative moves forward. The construction company is awarded a permit. 3 subcontractors are hired, each with quiet ties to the same syndicate that hosted the meeting. But everything is clean. The foundation Matsuo recommended receives a generous donation, opens a library, holds English classes. The press attends the ribbon cutting. Smiles are photographed, hands are shaken. No one mentions the basement floors. And Matsuo? He never returns to Fukuoka. He doesn't need to, because power to him isn't presence. It's residue. It's the kind of influence that doesn't appear on seating charts but is felt in who gets to sit at the table. And that day in Fukuoka, the table was set. The utensils were clean. And the meal, though unspoken, was served. The waiting room smells of antiseptic and mint. Bright overhead lights flicker slightly in the hallway, casting long shadows over neatly arranged dental pamphlets. Gum health through discipline. Your third molar and you. All untouched. The receptionist doesn't make eye contact. She's seen this particular guest before. Seijiro Matsuo doesn't come here for his teeth. Well, technically he does. Twice a year. Cleanings, polishing, x-rays if necessary. But the real purpose lies deeper. In the walls, behind the humming equipment, and in the brief, whispered moments that pass between recline and rinse. Dr. Atsushi Hayama is not just a dentist. He's a vessel. A man who, long ago, treated the son of a mid-ranking mobster, fixed his jaw after a drunken street brawl, and somehow found himself rewarded not with cash, but with a kind of permanent client base. Unofficial, cash-heavy, and unrecorded. The clinic remains spotless, The procedure's legitimate. But the patient list? Curated. Matsuo, of course, doesn't schedule through the receptionist. He calls a private line, never from home. The appointments always fall late in the afternoon. And the conversations? They begin only when the chair reclines and the suction tube hums just loud enough to blur the edges of speech. On this particular visit in 1983, Matsuo sits back as Hayama leans in. No inflammation, Hayama says, tapping lightly on a molar. Gums are steady. Any pressure near the bridge? Matsuo exhales. A bit in the lower left, but they're not talking about teeth anymore. The bridge refers to a property, a disputed stretch of commercial real estate in Saitama that two connected construction firms are quietly fighting over. Matsuo has received calls. One of the firms hosted a fundraising dinner last month. The other delivered a lacquered calligraphy scroll to his assistant, unsigned but unmistakable in style. Pressure, in this case, means threats. The kind that arrive in business language, not fists. Lawsuits, tax inspections, anonymous tips to the press. Hayama probes gently, the mirror angled just enough to catch Matsuo's eyes. Extraction? Matsuo shakes his head. Not yet, just adjust the alignment. Hayama nods once, understood. What follows is a normal procedure. Rinse, scale, polish. But the real work is already in motion. That evening, a low-level official in the city's tax office receives a call recommending a review of certain financial filings. The review begins, but only on one of the firms. A polite favor, a tilt of the table. And Matsuo? He attends a committee meeting on urban expansion the next day, as if nothing has shifted. Because nothing has. Visibly, many people still think Matsuo's dentist sessions were little more than folklore. So what do you think? Is it paranoia to believe that a reclining chair and a mouthguard could serve as tools of political coordination, or is it simply efficient multitasking? Hayama never speaks about Matsuo, not to journalists, not to friends. In fact, when asked in a 1990 alumni newsletter about his most interesting patients, he writes only, "Each mouth is a map, some with roads well hidden." Matsuo, for his part, remains loyal. He never sees another dentist. Even when traveling, he arranges flights around his cleanings. Once, during a tense legislative week, he delayed a high-stakes vote by requesting medical leave. He returned the next day with brighter teeth and 3 pages of notes on sewer district reclassification. It becomes something of an inside joke among his aides. Policy cleaned and flossed, one of them quips in a hallway after a new bill passes with zero resistance. But beneath the humor, everyone understands. Hayama is part of the mechanism, a release valve, a conduit for decisions that don't belong in email or ink. There's one especially quiet incident, never recorded, rarely spoken of, that defines this relationship. A junior clerk in the zoning office reports an irregularity, notices that 2 project bids list the same subcontractor under different shell companies. He flags it. The memo reaches a supervisor. The name on the page matches one associated with a known syndicate back in 1972. Within days, the clerk receives a summons to the dentist. Odd, since he hasn't made an appointment, but the card arrives in the mail. Typed, neatly folded. He attends. Hayama cleans his teeth, speaks softly, mentions gum disease, overbrushing, and then, casually, sometimes the pain isn't decay, it's just the pressure. The clerk nods, and that's it. The memo is never followed up. The irregularity dissolves. The clerk later transfers to a different department, urban recycling. Less oversight, more routine. Matsuo, of course, sends no messages, because he doesn't need to. He's built a network, not of enforcers, but of interpreters. People who understand what silence means. People who know how to say extraction and hear removal. How to say bridge pressure and mean someone needs reminding. That's the genius. No threats, no violence, just language and knowing when not to use it. One rainy afternoon, after a particularly tense vote in the Diet, Matsuo visits Hayama again. No appointment, no chart. Hayama simply gestures toward the chair. Matsuo sits. Nothing to clean today, Hayama says softly. No, Matsuo replies. Just needed the quiet. They sit in silence for a while. Then Matsuo stands, nods once, and leaves. Outside, the rain patters gently on the pavement, and Tokyo moves on, unaware that its arteries are still being cleared in rooms that smell faintly of mint and secrets. It's late on a Wednesday evening in Osaka, and the lights of Dotonbori shimmer against puddles left by a passing storm. Neon signs flicker like half-kept promises, and laughter from nearby izakayas floats lazily through the alleys. Tucked behind a noodle shop that never closes is an unmarked staircase, poorly lit, leading to a door without a sign. Behind it, a brothel. Well, not officially. On paper, it's a therapeutic relaxation lounge, but no one using that term believes it. What makes this place unique isn't what goes on inside, it's what goes on upstairs, because the second floor houses a tatami-lined room with a small fridge, 3 folding chairs, and a view of nothing. That room, once a week, becomes the site of policy negotiation. Tonight, the conversation will tilt the scales on something far more consequential than zoning laws or party strategy. Licensing, specifically, adult entertainment licenses, those precious slippery documents that determine who can operate where, how late, and under what guise. It should be a bureaucratic formality. But in Osaka, where entertainment meets enterprise meets influence, those licenses mean power. And power, real, usable, silence-backed power, belongs to those who can make votes move without drawing attention. Seijiro Matsuo doesn't usually travel for these matters, but this one's delicate. A recent push from local reformists has placed adult licensing under renewed scrutiny. A wave of moral posturing, fueled by press attention and religious community groups, threatens to tighten restrictions that have long served as economic bedrock for a network of Matsuo's more discreet associates. So he comes in person. The meeting is brief, a single hour. 3 local lawmakers, 2 business representatives, 1 retired police commissioner who speaks little and nods often. Matsuo doesn't argue. He listens. Then he offers a suggestion. Amend the vote. Not block it, amend it. Add a clause about cultural preservation, he says. Frame adult entertainment as a form of regional identity. Tie it to post-war history, folk performance, nostalgic urban tourism. The room falls quiet. Then one of the lawmakers, the youngest, laughs. That's absurd, he says. Matsuo turns to him. Absurdity, he replies, is only a matter of sequence. If you say it after the applause, it's tradition. The next day, a revised draft of the licensing bill includes a section, Article 4, Clause C, that exempts establishments classified under cultural entertainment sectors from certain restrictions. The brothel's business license is renewed within the week. The reformists fume. The press shrugs. And the public? They never read past Clause B. Many people still think this vote was where Matsuo crossed a moral threshold. So what do you think? Was it manipulation? Or a pragmatic act of economic preservation? The establishments protected under Clause C go on to sponsor festivals, community cleanup days, and even fund a scholarship for students pursuing cultural heritage research. None of the recipients ever visit the second floor of the noodle shop, but their essays get printed in polite journals. One even thanks Matsuo in a footnote. Meanwhile, his office receives no inquiries. because nothing he signed connects him to the vote. Nothing he filed bears his name. But the legislators who introduced the amendment? All three received campaign contributions within the month, not from Matsuo, from Friends of Urban Harmony, a non-profit with no office, no website, and no meetings. But its tax ID traces back to an attorney who once shared an apartment building with Matsuo in university. When asked, the attorney simply says, "Urban harmony is everyone's responsibility." Back in Tokyo, Matsuo receives a handwritten thank you note from an Osaka restaurateur. It's vague. Talks about maintaining community texture. Enclosed is a voucher for a hot spring inn near Nara. He doesn't use it. Files it away in a drawer labeled Misk South. Later that year, a councilwoman proposes a review of all existing licenses under the amended clause. Her proposal is tabled indefinitely after a series of budget emergencies. She resigns quietly 2 months later, opens a cafe in Kyoto, serves excellent coffee, never speaks about her time in office. Matsuo, meanwhile, speaks less and less. He begins writing in shorter sentences. His memos come with fewer qualifiers. Investigate the route. Shift the timeline. Leave that one sleeping. His aides joke that he's becoming more poetic with age. But poetry is a luxury. Matsuo is refining language into a scalpel. He understands now that complexity is a kind of camouflage, and that the best concealment is in plain sight. So when he's asked, months after the licensing vote, whether he believes adult businesses should be regulated more strictly, he simply replies, all industries must reflect the values of the people they serve. No one presses further, because in Matsuo's world, a sentence like that isn't a dodge. It's a lock, and behind it, the machinery turns, quietly, endlessly, just out of sight. In December, just as Tokyo slips into its annual hush, when the cold settles into the city's bones, and even the neon signs seem to blink more slowly, an unusual delivery arrives at Seijiro Matsuo's office. A wooden crate, carefully wrapped, no return address. It's carried in by 2 men dressed as postal workers, though one of Matsuo's aides notices their shoes, polished, leather, out of place with the uniforms. Inside the crate, 6 lacquered gift boxes, each embossed with a pine tree in gold leaf, and within those, nestled in white silk, are items far more delicate. Handmade fans, incense carved into kanji shapes, and the centerpiece, an antique inkstone wrapped in paper from Gifu Prefecture. No letter, no name, but everyone knows. Because in the silent lexicon of favors, Gifu is a signature all its own. The region, while rural and often overlooked by national headlines, has long served as a staging ground for Matsuo's less visible alliances. It's where money can be parked without notice, where land deeds change hands through firms that operate out of borrowed addresses, and where loyalty is expressed not through declarations, but through winter gifts. And these gifts, they're more than ceremonial. They are receipts, proof of past favors honored, an acknowledgement that whatever needed to happen in the spring was, in fact, delivered. What exactly that was, well, that depends on who you ask. Some believe it was tied to a highway rerouting proposal that passed without public hearing. Others whisper of a forestry fund, one that diverted resources from Tokyo's conservation budget toward rural revitalization. And there's a third theory, that the gifts were thanks for silence, that someone, or something, was supposed to be investigated and wasn't. Many people still think the Gifu gifts represent Matsuo's most refined layer of influence, less about favors now, and more about rituals. So what do you think? Were these tokens of gratitude, or gentle reminders of shared complicity? Matsuo says nothing, of course. He unwraps each item with care, nodding faintly at the weight of them. The fans are placed in a drawer labeled cultural donations. The incense is left burning in the corner for exactly 9 minutes, and the inkstone, he uses it just once. to write 3 words in elegant sloping script, already repaid twice. The pages folded, tucked into a sealed envelope, and handed to his driver, Fujita, with instructions to deliver it to the contact in the north. No address given. Fujita understands. That's the thing about Matsuo's circle. They don't require explanations, only directions. And even those come sparingly. Later that week, another shipment arrives at the Tokyo archives. A revised blueprint for rural logistics centers, now prioritized for grant eligibility. Gifu appears prominently in the draft. No one raises questions. The documentation is airtight, the language bureaucratically immaculate. In public, Matsuo continues his quiet work. He sponsors a bill on regional connectivity, hosts a panel on economic inclusion, attends a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a local museum renovation, funded, partially, by a company that also happens to own 3 of the warehouses near the new highway exit. At the ceremony, he gives a short speech. Tradition, he says, is not simply what we preserve. It is what we permit to remain. Polite applause follows. The audience claps because they're expected to. But in the 3rd row, a man with a lapel pin shaped like a pine tree nods once, deeply, then leaves before the speech ends. No one sees him go, Matsuo notices. That evening, back in his office, he reviews a folder marked Rural Holdings G. The pages are clean, the summaries vague, but at the bottom, scrawled in pencil, are 2 words. No follow-up. The phrase isn't an order, it's a mood, a temperature setting. Because Matsuo's gift system isn't about bribes, it's about weather. Maintaining just the right warmth. Not too hot to attract suspicion. Not too cold to suggest indifference. And the Gifu winter? Perfect for that. One of his aides, new to the office, once asked about the regional gift system. Should we send something back? She wondered. Matsuo replied without looking up. Never return a winter gift. That's not our season. She didn't ask again. She's always there. Not on the guest list. Not mentioned in the memos. Not even acknowledged in the follow-up summaries. But if there's a fundraiser, a private dinner, a reception in a rooftop lounge somewhere between Shibuya's shadows and Kasamigaseki's corridors, there she is, the girl with red gloves, always the same, mid-30s perhaps. Perfect posture, hair pulled back into a low chignon, a black clutch purse she never opens, and those gloves, bright crimson, satin finished, never wrinkled, never removed. At first, most assumed she was an assistant, a protocol handler, someone from event staff who just had a particular fondness for color coordination. But then she started appearing at events where only donors were permitted, at functions where no staff were allowed in the reception room, at briefings where even diet aides waited outside. And yet, there she was, standing within arm's reach of the money tray. And that's when people started wondering. The red gloves weren't fashion, they were function, a signal. To those who knew how to read it, her presence meant one thing: discretion. Because in Matsuo's world, the flow of capital is rarely linear. Donations don't arrive via briefcases or bank wires, not directly. They filter through intermediary steps, washed in legitimacy, dried in policy language. And the girl with red gloves? She's one of those steps, never speaking, never recording, but always present. At one particular dinner, a minor minister, drunk on imported wine, whispers, "Who is she?" Matsuo looks at him, smiles gently. "An archivist," he says, and the minister, too embarrassed to ask again, nods as if that answer made sense. One journalist, an intern at the time, once tried to follow her, not in a thriller film sort of way, just curiosity. From a fundraising event in Nihonbashi, the girl exited quietly through the back, stepped into a black sedan, and disappeared into the city's soft folds. 2 days later, the journalist was reassigned. Culture desk, book reviews. When asked what happened, he simply shrugged and said, "Red gloves. Bad luck." Many people still think the girl is merely a courier. Someone who receives the discreet nod, carries the envelope, ensures the handshake never lands in ink. But others say she's more than that. A ledger in human form. So what do you think? Could one person truly manage so much trust without ever speaking? It's not impossible, because Matsuo doesn't choose employees. He cultivates instruments. She appears in photographs only once, an official image from a reception, celebrating the opening of a community development initiative. Everyone's smiling. Matsuo stands near the center, unassuming as always. And in the background, just beyond the camera's depth of field, a sliver of crimson silk and a pair of gloved hands resting lightly on a donation ledger. The image circulates briefly, then is pulled from the website. Clerical error, the caption reads, wrong file uploaded. The red-gloved woman continues her appearances, always near Matsuo's financial epicenters, never speaking, never stepping forward, but always there when funds must change paths, when gifts must be accepted without fingerprints, when policy shifts require not just intention, but liquidity. One former aide remembers her clearly. She never wrote anything down, he says. But if you left a sealed envelope next to the ledger, it was always in the right place the next day, and never spoken of again. A security guard, years later, tells a story, how during a fire drill, while everyone else shuffled to the stairwell, she remained at her post, unbothered, holding a leather case in one hand and a lacquered tray in the other. I asked her if she needed assistance, he says. She just smiled. Then she disappeared before I turned around. Matsuo never publicly acknowledges her role. But during a policy review session, someone from the finance ministry jokes, if I ever get lost, I'll follow the red gloves. Matsuo looks up and says quietly, then be sure you don't blink. By 1984, red gloves begin appearing in whispers. A metaphor, a cautionary tale, a punchline among those in the know. And yet, no one ever replaces her. Because how do you replace silence that walks? How do you duplicate someone who understands that presence is more potent than persuasion? She becomes a fixture not in personnel records, but in atmosphere. And when she vanishes for 3 months, no events, no fundraisers, no sightings. The tension is palpable. Then, during a low-key donor dinner at a hot spring inn in Atami, she returns. Same gloves, same stillness, same position, just behind the chair where Matsuo will sit. Nothing is said. Nothing needs to be. Because in the world Matsuo has built, where policy is choreography and funding moves like fog through lantern-lit hallways, she is not just a woman. She is punctuation, the period at the end of a quiet sentence that changes everything. It begins with a whisper and ends with resignation letters printed on 2 perfect stationery. In late 1984, the Liberal Democratic Party is feeling unsettled. Rumors swirl through Nagatacho like cold wind between stone walls that Matsuo has become too large, too immovable, too untouchable. He has no formal leadership title, yet his fingerprints are on every successful motion. Bills pass when he nods. Committee chairs consult him in private. And the donations? They no longer orbit the party's official coffers. They flow, somehow, to the outer edges, through foundations, councils, cultural initiatives. Matsuo quietly guides. And so one night a plan is drafted. Nothing theatrical. Just an internal vote to strip Matsuo of his influence over 3 key subcommittees: budgetary, zoning, and procurement. He'll still hold his seat, of course, but the levers of motion will be pulled back, returned to party hands. It's whispered as a necessary recalibration, and for a moment it almost happens. The party elders gather. So do their quiet allies. The younger representatives are told this is for balance, that Matsuo's reach has become impractical, that no man should be above structure. But just before the motion is introduced, literally hours before a closed-door vote. Two things happen. The first, a photograph circulates. It's not published. Not formally. But it lands in the inboxes and briefcases of all relevant decision-makers. The image is grainy but clear enough. It shows one of the motion's architects, an aging vice minister, at a ryokan outside Nara, deep in private conversation with a known business figure whose name appears on more than one investigative ledger. The second, a committee clerk finds her inbox flooded with requests, sudden, oddly synchronized requests, for reviews of grant funding tied to nearly every legislator supporting the motion. Nothing formal, just routine checks. The motion is never introduced. Instead, 5 members resign. 2 cite health. One takes a university post in California. Another vanishes from politics entirely. The 5th, most curious, publishes a memoir 6 months later about ethical discomfort. Though no specifics are ever given, many people still think the failed coup was the last real attempt to curtail Matsuo's influence from inside the party. So, what do you think? Was this a man merely defending his political position? Or did the room learn, once and for all, what silence weaponized truly looks like? Matsuo, of course, never addresses the incident. Publicly, he hosts a policy roundtable on efficient governance. He smiles, answers questions, shakes hands with 2 of the very men who tried to sideline him. One of them laughs nervously afterward, telling a journalist, "He shook my hand, but I swear it felt like I signed something." Back in his office, Matsuo writes a single sentence on a yellow legal pad. When loyalty fails, gravity works just fine. He folds the note into his personal archive, the same drawer where the missing memo was once memorialized, the same place he keeps the photo of the Kyoto temple and the sake cup from his induction night. And then he moves on, because Matsuo doesn't gloat. He doesn't need to. His power isn't about dominance, it's about inevitability. The people who tried to push him aside didn't understand that. They thought influence was something you could draw a circle around. Matsuo was the paper. In the weeks that follow, subtle changes ripple across the bureaucracy. Committee chairs revise attendance policies, now requiring pre-approval for voting absences. A draft policy review board is established, chaired, unsurprisingly, by a longtime Matsuo ally. Even the press pulls back. A reporter for Tokyo Journal, who'd been digging into Matsuo's fundraising history, publishes a puff piece about urban beautification initiatives instead. When asked why he dropped the investigation, he says, "The story wasn't worth the silence that followed." Behind the scenes, Matsuo's circle tightens. Fewer visitors, shorter memos, more proxies. He begins using intermediaries even for conversations he once handled personally. Not because he fears exposure, but because distance is now his currency. Even his driver Fujita notices the shift. "You don't go in anymore," he says once, as Matsuo stares out the window, watching a cluster of campaign posters being peeled off a wall. Matsuo replies, "Presence makes shadows, proximity makes heat, but distance leaves no fingerprints." That year, a new term begins in the Diet. Matsuo walks into the chamber, same tie, same calm pace. He takes his seat, and 2 rows in front of him, a legislator who once voted against one of his budget proposals shifts uncomfortably, adjusts his papers, looks back only once. Matsuo doesn't smile. He just nods, once, like gravity reminding you it's still there. The notebook is small, leather-bound, worn smooth at the corners, and always kept in the top drawer of a locked cabinet beneath a decoy stack of zoning proposals. Black, unmarked, ordinary, except it isn't, because inside this notebook, known only to 2 people and carried home each night by one, is a quiet empire. Names, dates, single-word entries, nothing elaborate, just enough to jog memory, just enough to make a phone ring somewhere with the right tone of voice on the other end. Seijiro Matsuo never writes full names. never writes full amounts. He doesn't need to. Each notation is a signal coded in the shorthand of consequence. K in a gallery, delayed 2 mo's. Ferry, second review denied. C. Y item stadium, worn once only. The notebook isn't illegal. It's not even technically improper, but it is damning in its own soft way. Because it shows a mind that doesn't just remember, but designs memory as a kind of map. One of Matsuo's most trusted aides, Nakamoto, once stumbled upon it accidentally while searching for a misplaced development file. He opened it, read 3 lines, closed it again. That afternoon, Matsuo poured him tea and said, without turning his head, "Some books are meant to be closed more than they're read." Nakamoto never spoke of it again. The notebook becomes something of a myth in later years. Whispers circulate that it contains leverage, that it holds the key to a dozen resignations that never happened, that it was once used to settle a dispute between rival construction lobbies without a single conversation, just a faxed photocopy of 1 page sent from a post office in Shizuoka. All of these rumors, possibly true, because Matsuo didn't need confrontation. He had documentation, quiet, dense, coded documentation, a kind of moral gravity no one wanted to test. And yet, one year, during an office renovation, the notebook vanishes, not stolen, just moved, temporarily misplaced. Panic doesn't follow. Matsuo is too composed for that. But a quiet review of entry logs occurs. Access badges are audited. Security footage is scanned. No culprits found. 3 days later, the notebook reappears. On his desk, wrapped in brown paper, taped shut. No note, no fingerprints. Just one difference, an added page. New handwriting, not Matsuo's. 4 lines. "We don't want to be in it. We're not against you. But some entries aren't yours to keep. We've removed 4. Matsuo reads the page once, then rips it out, burns it, keeps the rest. He doesn't retaliate. He revises. 4 names are now only initials. 4 events vanish from the silent calendar, and the notebook continues its role, not as a threat, but as a mirror. A thing that reflects power so efficiently that even the ones inside it fear its weight. Many people still think the black notebook is the reason no prosecutor ever touched Matsuo. So what do you think? Was it a journal of influence, or a passport through dangerous airspace? It's never entered into evidence. It never surfaces in memoirs. But one late evening, as Matsuo walks alone through the Hibiya gardens, hands behind his back, leaves crunching under shoes polished for decades, he stops beside a bench, sits, removes the notebook, and writes only 3 words. KY, final favor. No one knows who KY is, but 2 weeks later, a civic development plan in Kobe is pulled from review. The primary contractor replaced. No announcement, no objections. The press calls it a procedural streamlining. No one disagrees. In the days following, Matsuo clears 3 drawers in his office, sends 2 aides on vacation, cancels 1 dinner, and the notebook? It doesn't disappear. It simply thins, like a ledger approaching balance. Because the closer he gets to the edge of his career, the more whispers of retirement, of legacy, the more deliberate his entries become. Fewer names, more silence, and then finally, one evening, he writes nothing at all. He places the notebook on the shelf, next to the calligraphy inkstone from Gifu, below the sack cup from the ritual, and beside a small silver fan, folded, all symbols of weight, but now at rest. It's 1987, and Tokyo glows with affluence. The bubble economy is peaking, and the air itself feels inflated. Real estate signs bloom like cherry blossoms, and everyone, it seems, owns something that's rising in value. Gold watches glint in boardrooms. Land auctions spark bidding wars before sunrise. And in the midst of it all, Seijiro Matsuo moves through the corridors of government like a man entirely unbothered by frenzy. He still takes his tea without sugar, still folds his handkerchief the same way, But there's a difference now, not in how he acts, but in how others act around him. When Matsuo enters a room, conversations realign, not abruptly, not obviously, but subtly, like iron filings reacting to an invisible magnet. And those who once sought to challenge him, they've either retired, vanished, or now greet him with gentle phrases like, "Always good to have your guidance, Matsuo-sensei." And yet, the air around him is not peaceful. It's anticipatory, because the rumors have started that he might ascend, not just to a cabinet post, but higher, a potential ministerial appointment, maybe even a role that would put him in line for vice premiership in the next reshuffle. The suggestion circulates not in headlines, but in glances, between sips of sake at donor galas, on golf courses where no game is ever finished, but many decisions are made. But Matsuo says nothing. He doesn't campaign. He doesn't lobby. He waits. And while he waits, something strange begins to happen. People start disappearing. Not dramatically, just withdrawing. An old ally in the education ministry retires for health. A business partner relocates to Canada. A veteran fixer, famous for never missing a Matsuo-hosted event, declines an invitation and is never heard from again. Matsuo notices. He always notices, because he understands that ascent, if mishandled, becomes exposure. And the higher one climbs, the harder it is to see who's holding the rope. So when he receives a private message, hand-delivered in a plain envelope, that reads simply, "Your file is growing teeth," he takes it seriously. The envelope has no return mark. The handwriting is unfamiliar. But the phrasing? It's old school. The kind of warning that comes not from a rival, but from a reluctant friend. He burns the note, and the next morning, he begins to dismantle his candidacy before it ever becomes public. He declines 2 speaking invitations, shifts focus back to infrastructure, delivers a quiet lecture about the virtues of secondary influence, and, most tellingly, he personally declines a key donor's offer to introduce him at the summer retreat. "I serve better in shadows," he says. The donor doesn't argue. Many people still think Matsuo would have become a national figure had he only leaned forward. So what do you think? Was his retreat self-preservation, or a final masterful deflection? Whatever it was, it works. The attention fades. The rumor shifts. He doesn't want power, only influence. And no one fears a man who doesn't want power. Only the smart ones understand that such men are the most dangerous. Around this time, Matsuo begins formalizing something he's hinted at for years, a succession framework, not for a single heir, but for a network. A quiet lattice of functionaries, advisors, and ideologically pliable successors. People who will keep the gears oiled without needing to know why the machine exists. He dines with a rising politician from Chiba, connects him with a consulting group based in Fukuoka, recommends a city planner from Yokohama for an obscure advisory post in the central bank, invites a former aide to return from Singapore to take a position with a regional revitalization think tank funded by Matsuo's oldest supporters. He never calls it succession. He just calls it continuity. The old notebook stays on the shelf. He doesn't add to it anymore. But occasionally, he removes a page, burns it, erases the trail, not to forget, but to release. One afternoon, a staffer finds a sheet of paper in the shred bin. Unusual. Matsuo never discards anything carelessly. The paper contains a list, 10 names, next to 7 of them. 1 word, settled. Next to 2, watch. The 10th name is left blank. Above the list, a short line in red ink. No need for gratitude, just momentum. That summer, a legislative bill passes. One Matsuo did not author, did not sign, did not publicly support. But buried in its language is a clause that mirrors a phrase he once used in an old zoning memo. multi-tiered discretion in rural procurement assessment. Only one person alive remembers the phrase, and he's the one who voted yes, because Matsuo no longer needs to speak to move policy. He's become the pause between clauses, the silence before agreement. His legacy isn't a statue, it's a structure, and it keeps standing. Even when no one can name the architect, there is no announcement, no press release, no farewell banquet, but quietly, almost imperceptibly, Seijiro Matsuo begins to vanish. Not disappear, no. Disappearance implies drama. This is gentler, like fog lifting before anyone realized it had settled. He still arrives at the diet, but less frequently. Still meets with contacts, but only in neutral locations. Quiet cafes in Akasaka, secluded corners of public libraries, rooftops with no cameras, and only the wind as witness. And slowly, his name fades from daily memos. His initials no longer appear in committee recommendations. His guidance comes only when sought, and even then never twice. In his office, dust gathers, not on his desk, still orderly, still precise, but on the spaces around it. The corners where visitors once stood nervously, the chairs where junior aides once waited to be summoned. The room has the stillness of a closing shrine, reverent, untouched. One day, the red-gloved woman stops appearing, just like that. No goodbyes, no sightings. A fundraiser is held. She's not there. A finance committee dinner, absent again. Someone whispers, "She's retired." Another says, "No, she was never real." Matsuo, when asked, says only, "Her silence was her answer." He no longer brings the notebook to work. It remains in his study at home, behind a row of poetry books, between Akutagawa and Basho, shelved among fiction, though it never contained a lie. By now, many in his orbit have moved on, some to higher office, some to private consulting, a few to early graves, victims of their own ambitions. And yet, when new legislators stumble into unfamiliar corridors of power, they're often warned. If Matsuo ever calls you, just listen. Don't speak unless he asks. It's become folklore, the kind born not of stories, but of side glances. There's one final event, a symposium on ethical governance. Ironic, perhaps, but fitting. Matsuo is invited to speak. He arrives alone. No entourage, no aides. He takes the podium, looks over the room, smiles faintly, then says, "When systems forget their purpose, they produce noise instead of motion. I prefer stillness." It's a short speech. Afterward, a young law student approaches him, asks, "Do you regret anything?" Matsuo looks at him, considers, then answers, "Only the things I didn't leave quiet." The student doesn't understand. Not yet. But years later, when he finds himself authoring a bill that no one instructed him to write, but which feels necessary, he remembers that phrase and wonders, because that's Matsuo's final legacy. Not commands, but suggestions whispered into permanence. Not policy, but posture. He doesn't die in office, doesn't vanish in scandal. Instead, he simply ceases to appear. A final memo circulates months later. Just 5 words. All positions returned with gratitude. Many people still think Matsuo orchestrated his exit years in advance. So what do you think? Was his retirement a bow, or a ghost walking backward into shadow? There's no clear answer, only the quiet echo of an empire that never raised its voice. The neighborhood is quiet, set back from the main roads of Setagaya, on a hill that catches the morning light just right. The house is modest. 2 stories, slate roof, paper lantern still hung beside the front door even though the last festival passed weeks ago. There's no nameplate, no guards. Just an old pine tree in the front yard and a small gravel path that crunches gently under careful footsteps. This is where Seijiro Matsuo lives now. If lives is the right word. He doesn't host visitors, doesn't grant interviews, rarely answers the phone unless it's from an old number. And even then, he says little, listens more. He shops at the market himself. Early mornings. just before sunrise, wearing a plain coat, cap pulled low. He greets the fishmonger with a nod, the produce vendor with 2 words. Same as always. No one calls him sensei anymore, at least not aloud, but some still bow a little deeper than necessary. Inside, his home smells faintly of cedar and ink. One room is dedicated to calligraphy, a low table, brushes arranged like surgical tools, paper stacked in precise quadrants. He no longer writes names, just characters, single, silent meanings. Wait, echo, absence. There's a radio in the kitchen, always tuned to classical. And on the bookshelf, near the bottom, the black notebook remains, untouched, dusty now, a relic not of what was done, but what was possible. And once a week, precisely at 4:30 p.m., a brown envelope arrives in his mailbox. No stamp, just tucked there. Inside, clippings, photocopies, handwritten notes, updates from a world still moving in patterns he once nudged. Sometimes he reads them, sometimes not. He knows enough without needing to know everything. Many people still think Matsuo left a vacuum when he retired. But what do you think? Is it a vacuum if the system continues to move in the direction he set? One autumn afternoon, a small gathering takes place in a downtown hotel. A junior minister is being celebrated for passing a reform bill. There are speeches, applause, the clicking of champagne flutes. Someone jokes, "We should invite the ghost of Matsuo." Laughter, but a few glance toward the doorway, just in case. He's not there, of course. He's home in the garden, pruning bonsai, snipping quietly, turning the pot by degrees. Not for shape, but for balance. Every cut calculated, not rushed, not reactive. The wind carries voices from the street, a child's laughter, bicycle bells, distant construction. He pauses, takes in the silence between noises. That's always been his favorite part, that soft space where nothing presses. And later, as dusk folds across the tatami mats, he writes one final kanji on clean paper, yubai, yohaku. The space left intentionally blank, a concept most people never grasp. But Matsuo lives inside it now, not forgotten, just uninsisted upon. At 7:10 p.m., his tea finishes steeping. He drinks it without sugar, same as always. And upstairs, a breeze catches the edge of the black notebook, flipping one page. Just one. Then it rests again. Still. So now, as we leave the quiet streets of Setagaya and the fading shadow of Matsuo's long journey, let's let everything slow. Let your breath ease. Let the last echoes of Tokyo's distant rush melt into soft wind, rustling pine, the crisp shuffle of gravel beneath simple shoes. Let your mind return to that room, the one with calligraphy brushes laid like memories, the old pine just beyond the window, its branches tracing lullabies against paper walls. The world Matsuo built was never loud. It didn't need headlines to endure. Just a glance, a nod, a silence offered with precision. And maybe tonight, as the lights dim and your thoughts begin to quiet, you'll find yourself drifting somewhere like that. A place not of power but of peace. A place shaped by restraint, where legacies aren't sculpted by statues, but by the people who still pause at the mention of a name and wonder what might have happened if they had listened closer. So take one last deep breath. Let the day release its grip. Close your eyes to the flicker of city lights, to the hush of ledgers finally balanced. You're safe here. The world can wait until morning. And Matsuo? He'll still be there, somewhere behind the silence, tending a bonsai, or folding a note no one will ever read.